Story 1. I always knew that long-distance relationships are not easy. They require patience, confidence, and, most importantly, trust. In the first months of our relationship with the girl, I felt like I was on cloud nine. We were starting to build our story, and although the distance seemed insurmountable, I truly believed that we could cope. We spent hours on phone calls, texted, surprised each other, and tried to create moments that could at least slightly smooth out this barrier separating us. I lived in hope that despite the miles, we could build something real. At that moment, I was ready to spend any amount of time and effort to maintain this relationship. Every day was full of conversations, sometimes meaningless, sometimes profound, but always special. Even in the most difficult moments, I believed that it didn't matter how much distance there was between us. What mattered was that we felt each other. We were connected by something more than just physical intimacy. However, with each passing month, the situation became more and more difficult. The distance, despite our efforts, began to make itself felt. Sometimes I felt that we were missing real conversations, that those phone calls and messages were no longer a substitute for real communication. More and more, I began to realize that sometimes the feeling of loneliness and alienation became almost insurmountable. It seemed that I could not feel her, could not understand what was happening in her life at that moment when we were not in touch. I tried to set myself up for the idea that these were temporary difficulties, that after some time we would be able to be together, and then all these problems would be left behind. But the further we went, the clearer it became that long-distance relationships require much more than just good intentions. Each of our meetings was like a holiday, but there were many empty days between meetings. It was not enough to just feel her next to me, to hear her laughter in person, to see her gaze. We took steps towards each other, but these steps were as if by touch, in the dark, not knowing what awaited us. But I always tried to be sure. I tried not to dwell on those moments when I felt alone, when doubts and questions arose in my head that were difficult to find answers to. But sometimes it seemed to me that our connection was just an illusion. One day when I was at home and again immersed in my thoughts, I realized that trust is the basis of everything. And if this trust is broken, if you can't be sure of the other person, then there is nothing left. But I hoped that this was not so. As the months went by, I began to realize that there were many practical difficulties in a long-distance relationship beyond the emotional closeness. We couldn't see each other every day. We couldn't be together when things were going on in our lives. I couldn't comfort her when she was going through difficult times and vice versa. Every interaction we had became more about memories than the present. I saw how it was becoming more and more difficult for her to tell me what was going on with her because I was far away and couldn't be a part of her daily life. Every day I missed her more than ever. But despite all this, I continued to believe that we could make it through. I understood that without trust and openness, nothing would work, that we had to be honest with each other, even if we couldn't be physically together. The feeling of closeness and confidence that we had a future was the support that gave us the strength to continue. Sometimes there were some controversial moments in our communication. Sometimes I felt that her words and actions did not match. She was fixated on her studies, work, and personal problems, and I saw how her attention gradually eluded me. I tried to understand her, but sometimes it was difficult to accept her silence and distancing. However, I understood that this was a part of life, and I could not expect her to be always in touch, that her life would revolve around me. Sometimes it was normal, but sometimes I felt that we were moving away from each other. Despite all the difficulties, I tried to be supportive and patient. I knew that if I began to doubt her feelings, if I began to look for reasons to be suspicious, I would destroy what we had built. I fought this thought resolutely because I felt that trust was what our union was built on. But with each passing month, it became more and more difficult to maintain the confidence I felt at the very beginning. No matter how hard I tried to forget about the doubts, they still returned, slowly but surely. Sometimes, especially when there were some strange moments, when she could not immediately answer my calls or her behavior seemed strange to me, I began to wonder. However, I tried to remain calm because I believed that it was just my insecurity and anxiety due to the fact that we were so far apart. But at some point, everything changed. I couldn't ignore my feelings anymore. It became painfully obvious when I realized that I was starting to doubt more than I trusted. And those doubts were becoming intrusive. I could feel them creeping into my mind. And I knew that if I didn't learn to deal with them, they would destroy everything we had built. Yet despite all the worries and anxieties, I still believed in her and in us. I kept fighting because I loved her. But deep down, I knew something had to change. And maybe what I was looking for, the answer that would help me find peace and confidence in our future, was somewhere very close. On the day it all started, I didn't realize how much it would affect our relationship. Everything seemed normal, but even then I didn't know that before me lay a whole labyrinth of misunderstandings and worries that would soon lead to more serious consequences. Yesterday was one of those days when I felt especially close to her, despite the distance. She had just graduated from college, and I knew she would be a little free because her studies were finally over. At that moment, I thought that we would have time to talk, relax, and discuss how her day went. I called her with the hope of hearing her voice, to find out how she was feeling, how her day went. It was a moment when I thought the conversation would be easy and pleasant, as always, but everything went wrong. When I called, she answered, but her voice was a little tense. It was strange because she usually answered enthusiastically, but here she sounded a little reserved, like something was wrong. She said that she couldn't talk right now because her phone would die in a few minutes, and that she would call as soon as she got on the bus. I felt a little awkward that she ended our conversation so quickly, but at the time I didn't think it could be anything serious. I knew that her phone could actually run out of battery. It happens to everyone. But for some reason this time, despite all the explanations, I felt like something was wrong. Maybe it was just my inner anxious voice that always comes up when there's tension in a relationship. I tried to dismiss it, deciding that I was worried about a trivial thing, but deep down I was tormented by a feeling of discontent. A few minutes later, as she promised, I called again. This time she didn't pick up. Strange. I thought that maybe something really had happened. Maybe her phone had run out of battery, or she was in a place where she couldn't answer. I didn't think she was ignoring me. Still, after a while I texted her. It's urgent. To be honest, I didn't know what exactly I needed to say, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I remembered how many times we told each other that we would always be in touch, that we could trust each other, and that nothing would separate us even if we were far away. But now something had changed. I was sure that she would write to me, explaining what had happened and that everything would be fine. However, she didn't answer again. This began to make me feel irritated, and most importantly, insecure. Why wasn't she answering? Where was she? A few more minutes passed and I decided to call her again, but this time I chose a video call. I thought that maybe this way she would see that I really needed her attention. When she picked up the phone, I immediately knew that something was wrong. I didn't see her usual background, like I usually do. Something familiar, like her room or the place where she usually hangs out. Instead, I saw her face, but her surroundings were unfamiliar. I tried not to jump to conclusions, but a feeling of unease was already growing in my body. I asked her where she was, and she said that it was near the bus stop. This was strange. I knew that she was supposed to be on the bus, like she told me, but now she was outside, somewhere near the bus stop. The place was not as it should be. I tried to figure out what was going on. She kept talking, but her face was tense, and she wasn't showing anything but herself. The locations didn't match up, and her explanations were becoming less and less convincing. I found it hard to believe what she was actually telling me. I was sure she was somewhere else, and it was starting to irritate me. Why wouldn't she show me where she really was? Why was she hiding the details? When I insisted that she show more, she started making excuses again, saying that everything was fine, that nothing terrible was happening. She started saying that I shouldn't worry, that I was being overly suspicious. I felt her words starting to creep up on me, creating some kind of pressure. She was trying to convince me that everything was fine, that I shouldn't doubt, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And then, sometime later, she wrote to me. First, a short message. Sorry, I lied to you. I went to a restaurant with a guy. I couldn't believe my eyes. All my suspicions were confirmed. She told me she would be on the bus, but in reality, she was going to a restaurant with someone else. I felt my heart squeeze with anger and disappointment. 1,000 thoughts immediately popped into my head, each trying to understand what had happened and why she had done this. I was furious, not only because she had lied to me, but also because she had promised me a few days ago that she would not spend time with other guys anymore. She had sworn that it would never happen again, and here she was again, breaking her word. These promises she had made to me now seemed empty, and the question kept popping into my head. Why can't she be honest? Why can't she just tell me what happened, without these excuses and lies? From that moment on, I realized that my doubts were not random. These little signals that I ignored were real. I was back in a situation where I had to figure out what she was saying and what was actually going on. I don't know why, but that was the turning point for me. I felt the breakdown of trust begin to spread inside me. The moment she admitted she had lied to me was one of the most painful in our relationship. It had started with her simple excuse of going out with a guy. Everything that had happened before seemed so insignificant compared to what I had heard. The lies she had told me had hit me like a bolt from the blue. Everything I had known about our relationship now seemed distorted, like something I had made up for myself, constructed from unspoken words and promises, but not from reality. When she texted me that, I literally felt like the ground was falling out from under my feet. At some point, I just couldn't figure out how to react. I was trying to collect my thoughts and figure out what was going on. After all, a few days ago, when she promised me that she wouldn't spend time with other guys anymore, I actually believed her. How could she break her words so quickly? I was stunned, but deep down I knew it wasn't just a fluke. It wasn't just a mistake or a coincidence. She had done the same thing she had done many times before. At that moment, it was hard for me to understand why I couldn't just cut ties with her and leave her in the past. But despite all the pain, I still kept thinking there was something more between us. It all happened so fast, and I felt like that moment was not only destroying trust, but also questioning the very foundation of our relationship. The video call I made after her confession was like a last-ditch effort to make sense of the situation. I still wanted to believe there was a reason why she did what she did. I didn't know what to do next, but I wanted to at least hear her explanation. When I video called her, she didn't answer right away. I knew she could see the call, but she didn't pick up. My anxiety grew and I tried calling again, not yet realizing how this would change everything. When she finally picked up, her face was covered in some strange expression. Not anger, not sadness, but rather alienation. She looked at the camera, but did not make eye contact, as if she were avoiding direct contact. It was something new, and in that moment I knew that nothing would be the same as before. "Why can't you be honest with me?" was the first question I asked her, and it seemed to be the deciding one for me. I was so exhausted that I didn't even want to hear her explanation. I was sure that if she said one more time that it was no big deal or that everything is fine, I would simply walk away from the conversation. She started making excuses, as always, as if it was completely natural. "You know yourself that I didn't mean to hurt you," she said. It was a standard phrase that always appeared in such situations, but I couldn't accept her words. I was furious because she was trying again to make me believe her lies, her excuses, as if I were a stupid child to whom everything could be explained. I tried to keep my cool, but the anger that was building in my chest wouldn't let me rest. "You promised me you wouldn't do that again," I screamed, not even realizing how strong it sounded. It wasn't just a question. It was an emotional demand. I was demanding an explanation she couldn't give me. The lies were becoming so obvious that I began to realize that in my relationship with her, I wasn't getting what I was sure I had: honesty. There was no remorse in her answers, no desire to understand what she had done wrong. All I heard was excuses. She tried to convince me that it wasn't that serious, that it was just a chance meeting with a guy, but she was forgetting the important thing. It wasn't just a chance meeting. It was a whole evening spent with another person. In a restaurant, when she told me she would be on the bus, it was a betrayal of her promises. At that moment, I realized that I couldn't trust her words anymore. I couldn't believe her explanations, because they weren't worth a single ounce of trust. I was silent for a few seconds, unsure of what to do next. I knew we couldn't continue if she kept lying and breaking her promises. I felt empty inside, like everything we had built was collapsing like a house of cards. I never thought I'd come to this decision, but maybe now was the time to deal with it. I tried to run from my feelings, hide my pain, but deep down I knew it wouldn't lead to a good outcome. There was no point in lying to myself any longer. I had long felt that her words did not match her actions. This feeling was more deeply rooted than I wanted to admit. For a moment I wanted to just say, "I can't live with this anymore." But I didn't know how that would be received. I didn't know how she would react if I finally told her it was over. The moment I looked at her phone screen, I realized that things were much more complicated than I thought. I could see her face, but I couldn't feel her true essence. She was so far away from me, not just physically, but emotionally. We were in different worlds, and this video call was a last-ditch attempt to get us closer. But it only proved that we were drifting further apart. As the conversation came to an end, I felt an emptiness forming inside me. I didn't know what to do next. Maybe I should just break things off, end this relationship that had become so toxic. But on the other hand, I couldn't stop thinking that maybe she loved me after all. I couldn't know for sure, but at that moment, when she apologized, it seemed like she was genuinely remorseful. It was all so complicated, so confusing. However, deep down I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The next morning I woke up with heavy thoughts. My eyes did not open as easily as before, and even the sunlight that usually filled the room with some kind of comfort now seemed dim. I remembered the conversation with her words, her excuses, her confidence with which she told me that everything would be fine. But inside me there was no longer that feeling that everything would be the same. The previous evening had destroyed what seemed immutable. Every promise she made to me now felt like an empty sound. I didn't know why I'd allowed myself to believe those promises for so long. She'd told me she wouldn't spend time with other guys anymore, that she'd realized her mistakes and would never lie again. But now I knew they were nothing more than words she'd said to calm me down, to regain my trust. And unfortunately, I'd allowed myself to believe them too often. I'd been lying to myself. I knew that promises were just words, and maybe they meant nothing if they weren't backed up by actions. I was sitting at the table, a cup of coffee in front of me that I couldn't finish. My gaze kept returning to my phone. I didn't want to check it, but I did it anyway, over and over again. Everything was mixed up in my head. Resentment, anger, fear, doubt. But most of all, I felt disappointment. Disappointment in her. Disappointment in myself. Disappointment that I had allowed myself to be convinced that she would actually change. It seemed to me that now everything could not be returned. At that moment, I realized that I needed to be honest with myself. And as much as it hurt, I had to admit that trust is not something that can be restored with words alone. That day, I sent her a message to continue the conversation we had started the day before. I was ready to hear her explanation, but most of all, I wanted to hear that she was admitting her guilt, that she understood how much she had hurt me. I needed to hear that she understood the consequences of her actions. She responded quickly enough, but her message didn't contain what I expected. She apologized, yes, but her apology was as empty as her promises. She kept talking about how ashamed she was, but it seemed to me that she didn't fully understand what had actually happened. She was still trying to convince me that it was an accident, that she hadn't meant to hurt me. The words sounded familiar, but I didn't care what she was saying anymore. All I heard was a repetition of the same phrases she had said to me before, when she had done something I couldn't understand. They lost all meaning. I wrote to her that I couldn't continue living like this, that it was hard for me to be in this relationship when we kept coming back to the same things. I told her that I wasn't sure that I could trust her, because she had broken her promises again. I told her that I didn't want to worry about what she was doing anymore, and that I needed time to think. It was a heavy message, full of pain and disappointment. And although I tried to be calm, I wanted to scream. I wanted her to finally understand how much I had suffered. She wrote again that she was sorry and that she understood. But these words sounded like empty sounds, like words she said so as not to lose me, but I was no longer sure that they meant anything. I felt her apologies starting to irritate me even more, because these words were not backed up by anything. She could not take back what she had done. She could not restore the trust I had lost. At that moment, I realized that something had to change. Not in the relationship, but in my perception of everything that was happening. I could no longer afford to be naive. I could no longer close my eyes to what was happening. We were both to blame, both me and her. She was breaking her promises, and I continued to believe that everything would be fine, despite her actions. I allowed myself to be vulnerable because I thought it would be better for us, that I would be able to forgive her and we would be happy. But now I understood that relationships cannot be built on lies and deception. I decided that I needed to stop this constant cycle of disappointment and promises. We kept coming back to the same topic, and each time she said she wouldn't do it again, but it all happened again. I couldn't and didn't want to continue living like that. It was too painful, too destructive. I wanted our relationship to be real, honest, without a shadow of a doubt. But now I understood that for this to happen, we both needed to work on ourselves. I decided that I needed some time to think about everything that was happening, and first of all, to think about myself. I realized that I can't let a person destroy my inner peace. I had to regain control over my life and decisions. It was not an easy decision, but perhaps the only right one in this situation. Over the next few days, I kept thinking about what had happened. I kept thinking that if she had just been honest with me, if she had admitted her mistake and tried to earn my trust back, maybe things would have been different. But I also knew that I couldn't change her behavior. I couldn't make her act the way I wanted. And maybe that was the most painful realization for me, the knowledge that I couldn't control her actions. I thought over and over again about whether this relationship was worth continuing. Doubts never left me, and although I continued to love her, I understood that sometimes love is not enough to save a relationship. After I sent her that message that marked the end of our last conversation, I became more and more lost in my own thoughts. It was as if I was trapped in a trap I had built for myself. I was on the brink of a decision, but I couldn't quite figure out what I needed to do. The pain of her lies and the promises she hadn't kept burned inside me, but I still couldn't completely escape her. The doubts that gripped me were unbearable. I often told myself that I had to move on, that I needed to finally stop being dependent on her presence in my life. But inside me, there was still a small hope. Hope that things would get better, that she would truly realize her mistake, and that we could be happy if we gave ourselves a chance. But with each passing day, that hope became more and more illusory. I knew I was afraid of losing her, and it was a fear I couldn't handle. I knew that the relationship couldn't continue at this level. I felt everything inside me crumbling. Trust, respect, love, everything I once believed in became empty and unimportant. But there was another fear that tormented me. It was the fear of loneliness. I often wondered, what will happen if I lose her? Not because she was perfect, but because over the course of these 2 years, she had become a part of my life. I could no longer imagine myself without her, and this dependence frightened me. Every time I thought I was ready to break up with her, I felt a strange emptiness inside. It wasn't just breaking up with a girl. It was like I was tearing apart a part of my soul. At that point, I began to realize that even if I decided to leave her, it would be very difficult for me to move on. This relationship had become so deeply entangled that I didn't know how to end it without pain, without regret, without fear. Every day I was going through an internal struggle. I knew she didn't deserve to be forgiven for what she had done. I knew I couldn't let her continue to violate my boundaries and deceive me. But at the same time, I was unsure if I was doing the right thing by breaking things off. Questions were popping up in my head that wouldn't leave me alone. Maybe she really feels remorse. Maybe she will change if I give her another chance. That was the moment I realized that even if the decision felt right, it still left me feeling insecure. I couldn't help but feel afraid of the future. Would I be able to cope with being alone? Would someone else ever be able to take her place in my heart? These questions haunted me constantly, and even despite all her mistakes, I still kept thinking about us. I was afraid that I would no longer be able to find something as important in my life, something as meaningful. At some point, I even began to doubt myself. Maybe I'm just too demanding? Perhaps everything that was happening was the result of my own failed expectations? But the more I thought about it, the clearer one thing became. I couldn't continue to live like this. I couldn't let her destroy my emotions, my self-esteem, and my future over and over again, even if it meant being alone. It was painful, but I needed to understand that being alone wasn't always worse than being in a relationship where there was no trust. Being alone gave me freedom, a chance to come back to myself, to feel like a whole person again. I was starting to understand that my own life shouldn't depend on someone else. Every day that I thought about it, my doubts persisted. Among other things, I kept wondering how she would react if I made a final decision. Did she understand that this time I was more than just upset or hurt, that I might not be able to forgive her anymore? I was afraid that she would, as always, try to convince me that she had changed, that she was truly remorseful. And yet, despite my doubts, I knew I had to stop. After all, I wasn't the only one responsible for our relationship. We both had to take our share of the blame. I became more and more certain with each passing day that I could no longer continue this cycle of forgiveness and regret, but the fear of being alone was nagging at me. I was certain of one thing. I had to do something to finally break with what was poisoning my life. And although I knew that my decision would be painful, I knew that it was inevitable. Everything I experienced during this period haunted me. I searched for answers, but more and more often they became unimportant to me. I needed a change, something new, and despite the fear and doubt, I knew that the time had come. I didn't know how to begin, but I felt like every day that I continued to drag on only deepened the pain and disappointment I was feeling. My heart and mind had long since concluded that it was time to end this story. I wasn't sure I had the courage to take that step, but I knew that if I didn't do it now, I would suffer even longer. Everything that had happened in the last few weeks left me with no choice. My feelings became unbearable. I could no longer justify her actions. I could no longer return to the promises she broke. I could no longer hope that she would change. All her attempts to justify herself, her apologies, none of it mattered anymore. I saw her apologize, but her words were still empty, and her actions did not change. It was like a dead end, from which I was constantly trying to find a way out, but I could not. When I finally dialed her phone number, my hands were shaking a little. I knew that what I was about to say would change everything. I couldn't be with her anymore. Couldn't continue this relationship that had long since ceased to bring joy. We were no longer the couple we once were. All of that was long gone, and I couldn't ignore it. I waited for her to pick up the phone. There were many words in my head, but they all seemed wrong. How to say it correctly, how to make her understand that I can't go on any longer. I didn't know, but still, when she answered, I started talking. I think we need to talk. My words were calm, although there was a lot going on inside me. I continued, not giving myself time to doubt. I can't continue this relationship anymore. I've been patient for too long, hoping that you would change, but it doesn't happen. You've been breaking your promises all the time, and I can't trust what you say anymore. There was a few seconds of silence from her, and I felt my heart tighten. I didn't know what she was going to say, but I knew it had to. I couldn't let her continue to blame me for her mistakes. She couldn't continue to shift responsibility onto me, and I couldn't be her excuse any longer. "Are you serious?" she finally said. And her voice sounded like she couldn't believe I was breaking up with her. It was a shock. I felt like she didn't understand how this was possible, that I couldn't stand her mistakes any longer. "Yes, I'm serious. You've been lying to me all along, and I can't live with it anymore. You said you'd change, but I don't see any change. I can't trust you anymore, and it seems like you don't even realize how much it hurts me." I heard her sigh, then a few words that I didn't understand. She started apologizing over and over, but I didn't care anymore. I had already made my decision, and the words she said couldn't convince me. I already knew that I couldn't continue this. "I'm so sorry, but I can't be with you anymore." I said these words with pain, but also with relief. My inner voice said that this was right, that this was necessary for me to find myself again. "Don't leave, please. I'll improve. I promise. Give me another chance." Her voice was full of panic, and I felt like she was trying to hold me back. But I couldn't go back to that relationship where I felt cheated every time, where every promise she made seemed temporary and useless. "I can't do this anymore. I'm tired of the lies. You told me you wouldn't do it again, but every time I believe you, you break your word again. I can't live like this anymore." After these words, I felt an emptiness rise inside me. But it wasn't the emptiness that comes after a breakup, but rather relief. I didn't need to be in this relationship anymore. I didn't need to justify her actions or try to convince myself that everything would be okay. I was no longer willing to hide my feelings, no longer willing to continue this cycle. I couldn't allow myself to hope that things would change when in fact everything was obvious. I hung up without waiting for her answer. That was the moment I felt like I had finally made the right move. I couldn't say it was easy, but I knew I couldn't live in this world of lies and promises that weren't kept any longer. For days after that, I felt lost. Sometimes I felt like I had made a mistake, that I had made a decision too quickly. But at the same time, I knew that I couldn't continue living in that relationship. I had lost myself. All that time, I was looking for something that could bring me back to reality, to my peace, but I couldn't find it in that relationship. I knew that I couldn't blame her for everything that had happened, but I also knew that I couldn't justify her behavior any longer. The process of breaking up was painful, but necessary. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing. It was a step towards finding myself again. I didn't know what was in store for me, but I was sure that it was the right decision for me. A few weeks passed, and life began to take on different forms. The fear I had felt before the breakup dissolved in the fact that I no longer felt painful attachments. Although it was difficult at first to get used to the loneliness, to the silence that reigned in my life after all these years, I realized that this was not the end, but rather the beginning of a new stage. I did not know what was waiting for me ahead, but I knew one thing. I was no longer who I had been before, and this was liberating. Those first days after the breakup were chaotic. I thought a lot, tried to find answers to my questions, but my mind was filled with meaningless fragments of thoughts. I often thought about what I had lost, about how much I had invested in this relationship. And despite the disappointment, there was a sense of loss, like I had lost something important. It was a strange feeling, realizing that you were no longer with someone you once considered a part of your life. But I knew that eventually these feelings would fade. Time heals, as much as that sounds. I began to slowly return to my hobbies, which I had not devoted time to for a long time. I picked up books that I had not read for months. I returned to sports, to walks in the fresh air, to the things that brought me joy. But perhaps most importantly, I returned to myself. I began to rediscover a world that I seemed to have forgotten when I was absorbed in a relationship that brought neither happiness nor peace. During this period, I realized that despite the pain I felt in the beginning, I needed to go through this breakup. It became something important to me, not just a painful ending, but a kind of catharsis. This process allowed me to cleanse myself, to understand myself and my feelings. I no longer felt lost. I finally realized that the only person who could restore my inner harmony was myself. I no longer depended on someone else to determine my happiness or peace. I started meeting friends who had been long forgotten. I really enjoyed the time spent with them. These small joys filled my life again. Sometimes it seemed to me that I was finding myself again. It was as if I was waking up after a long sleep, and the world around me became bright and real. I felt my inner strength beginning to recover. The fear of the future went away, and I realized that there were many opportunities ahead of me. I began to look to the future with more confidence. I also began to notice how my self-esteem was gradually being restored. In our relationship, I often forgot about myself, submitting to her needs, her moods and promises. But now I realized that I could not live for others, forgetting about my desires, goals, and interests. I learned to be myself again, the way I was before all these storms and changes. Sometimes I wondered how things might have turned out if she had really changed, if we had found common ground and been able to build trust. But I no longer regretted what had happened. I understood that everything had happened exactly as it was supposed to. I couldn't go back, and maybe that was the right thing to do. I learned to appreciate what I had now and let go of everything that was holding me back. At some point, I realized that the most important lesson I learned from this experience was not to learn to trust others, but to trust myself. I learned to understand that even if other people make mistakes or cheat, I myself must not lose my power. I must remain true to myself and my values and not try to please or justify other people's actions. It was liberating to realize that I could build my own life, not depend on other people's decisions and actions. One day, as I was walking down the street, thinking about everything I had been through, I noticed how much had changed. I no longer looked back with regret. Instead, I began to feel proud that I had been able to go through it without breaking. This was my journey, and despite all the difficulties, I came out of it stronger. With each passing day, it became easier for me to see things from a different perspective. I realized that rebirth does not happen overnight, but it definitely happens if you are open to change and ready to move forward. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew that I was ready for life again, ready to meet new horizons, new opportunities, ready for new relationships, but most of all, ready to be happy with myself. Because as strange as it may sound, I realized that the most important love in life is the love for yourself. This breakup wasn't an end for me. It was a beginning, the beginning of a new chapter in my life where I became the main character again. I learned to let go. I learned to forgive. And I learned to appreciate every moment that I could now devote to myself. Everything that happened became part of my experience that shaped me into who I am today. And looking back, I felt grateful for the lessons I had to learn. It was hard, but without it, I wouldn't be the person I am today. Story 2. I never thought that my life, which seemed stable and harmonious, could change because of one new person. Everyone in my friend group had been a part of my life for many years. We had experienced joys and hardships together, and in a sense, we had become family to each other. Every evening we spent together was like a cozy replay of the past. Laughter, conversations, sharing personal stories and memories. And then, as if with a snap of the fingers, it all began to crumble. Anton was one of those people I went through a lot with. We weren't close friends, but his presence in our group was always a source of comfort and confidence. He was older, and in some ways, he always acted as an older brother to many of us. His opinion often played the role of authority, and I always felt that he was one of those people I could rely on. Everything I knew about him was positive. He was a kind, honest, and sincere person who always supported his friends. Then Molly came along. She was Anton's new girlfriend, and I remember meeting her for the first time at one of our regular evenings. She was smart, interesting, and shy enough to fit in well with our circle. I liked her quiet, almost magical charm, her ability to be interesting and quiet at the same time, not intrusive. At first, I didn't think she would play any special role in my life. She was just a new face added to the usual circle, nothing out of the ordinary. But as the days went by, I felt a tension in the air that I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. Molly became a little more withdrawn, and although I'd always considered myself an outgoing person, she didn't make any special effort to communicate with me. It wasn't that strange at first. Maybe I just thought she was shy or needed time to adjust. But soon I began to notice that something was wrong. I can't remember exactly when it all started to change, but more and more often I would catch Molly's gaze, which was full of confusion and hiding something. I can't explain it, but it felt like she didn't understand me. At first I thought it might just be my sensitivity, but as it happened again, it became clear to me that I wasn't the only one noticing this strange atmosphere. At some point I felt like her presence became too noticeable. I didn't like it, and strangely, I couldn't understand why. I didn't have any romantic feelings for Anton. We had never been in a relationship, and I never thought that something could change in this direction. Our relationship was simple, friendly, without hidden meanings. But everything changed when Molly began to suspect that I had feelings for him. It was just absurd. For some reason, she began to see me as a threat. Perhaps it was connected with her personal insecurities, with her past. But it was very painful. I did not want to be involved in this situation. At some point, it became clear to me that her suspicions were not only about me, but also about other girls in our circle. I realized that her fears began to grow, and at some point, she literally became afraid of any closeness between Anton and any of us. I even tried to talk to her, but every time her answers were dry and tense. It was strange because before that, I had never felt such a distance from her. Something was clearly wrong, but I didn't know how to solve it. When rumors started spreading that I was trying to seduce Anton, it was a real blow. I couldn't believe that anyone would think that I would do something like that. Anton and I had always been friends, and that was all there was to it. At first, I thought it was just a misunderstanding, that everything would work itself out. But the more time passed, the clearer it became that the situation was getting out of control. When the post appeared on social media blaming me for ruining the relationship, I felt the world shift from under me. It was a blow I didn't expect. I knew it was done out of fear, but that didn't make it any less painful. Knowing that someone could so easily paint you in that light was truly devastating. Eventually, the person apologized, but the damage was done. I couldn't see this situation as temporary anymore. Things got weird. I didn't feel comfortable in our gatherings anymore. I felt uneasy when I went to a group event where everyone except me seemed to be pretending that everything was okay. I couldn't help but notice how Anton and Molly weren't the people I once knew. Anton, who I thought was my friend, was now siding with Molly, even though he knew the truth. My perception changed. I began to feel like I couldn't be myself around them anymore. I couldn't understand how they could even continue to act as if nothing had happened. While they calmly continued to communicate, I was freezing inside. Everything seemed too fake and artificial. I tried to keep my distance, but it was clear that there was now a wall between us that was impossible to ignore. As rumors of my alleged deliberate attempt to seduce Anton began to spread, I felt myself losing control of the situation. I never thought my relationships with my friends could be tested like this, but here it was, the moment when my own words and actions were being questioned. I tried to remain calm and distance myself from what was happening, but it was becoming more and more difficult with each passing day. Molly was certainly an insecure woman. We all knew it. She had spoken openly about her past relationships and how hard it had been to deal with disappointment and betrayal. I could understand her feelings, especially since her experience with love had been far from perfect. But that didn't give her the right to accuse me like that without knowing the whole truth. I felt sorry for her. I knew she didn't see my actions as a threat, but she still perceived me that way. This sense of paranoia and resentment led her to build a wall of mistrust around me, and with every look she gave me, I felt that wall growing taller and stronger. I tried to be tolerant and willing to listen, but she didn't give me a chance to explain myself. Molly never approached me directly, never tried to discuss her point of view. Instead, she chose to give free rein to her suspicions and fears, and the result was an intervention in my life. The accusations did not stop, and every new conversation with her turned into a test. I had never experienced such a feeling. The emptiness that filled me did not allow me to explain anything. All I could do was remain silent and watch as a false version of events was formed from all this. At some point, I realized that this was no longer just a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate destruction of what I considered my world. And the worst thing was that I could do nothing about it. I could not correct the false ideas about myself because even those who had known me for a long time began to look at me with distrust. I could not understand why those who had been close to me all these years were now questioning my character and my intentions. It was like a stab in the back, so strong that I felt like I was losing myself. Over time, it started to take a toll on me internally. I started to feel isolated. Even my best friends, the ones I had been through so much with, started to look at me with doubt, despite the fact that they had known me for a long time. They couldn't understand what I was going through. They just couldn't. I remember sharing my pain with them, trying to explain how hard it was for me to go through all of this. But instead of being supported, I was met with incomprehension. I felt the words "just talk to them" echoing in my head, but they didn't really understand that it wasn't that simple. They didn't understand what it was like to be accused of something you didn't do, especially when it involved your friends. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a minor conflict. This was a real test of strength that undermined not only trust, but also my ability to believe in myself. I felt like I was losing myself, my confidence, and it hurt me immensely. When I started talking to Anton, I was full of hope that he would listen to me and understand that all this was absurd and had nothing to do with me. I tried to explain that I was not trying to ruin anything, that my relationship with him had never gone beyond friendship, but instead of supporting me, he took Molly's side. It was a shock. Anton, with whom we had been through so much, was on her side, and instead of understanding me, he began to justify her actions. He told me that I did not understand what she was going through, that she had emotional difficulties. But where was his reason, his friendship for me? It was painful. I couldn't understand why he couldn't just listen to me and give me a chance to justify myself. Instead, he agreed with her accusations, and it shattered my faith in our friendship. I felt like everything was crumbling around me, and even those moments that were once filled with joy and warmth were now filled with pain and alienation. In their eyes, I had become an enemy, not a friend. Then I realized that this situation no longer had anything to do with truth and reality. It was all a projection of Molly, her insecurity and fear that her relationship with Anton could be destroyed. But it was unfair to me. I did not deserve to be the object of her suspicions. And what was most offensive, I could not restore my reputation, because its destruction had already become part of their perception of me. I began to realize that I had to protect myself because no one else would. My heart was breaking because I knew I couldn't fight this forever. Molly and Anton seemed like they were part of the same story that no longer belonged to me. I began to think that it would be better for my mental health if I completely walked away from this situation. I needed space to heal, but I couldn't take it. I couldn't escape the people who had already hurt me. Several weeks passed, but the situation with Anton and Molly did not improve. Every time I tried to communicate with them, it seemed like they were digging deeper into their position, and I was becoming more and more distant from their world. Sometimes it seemed like their relationship with this issue was becoming more important than anything I could say or do. We had all been good friends once, and it was incredibly painful for me to realize how quickly those connections were crumbling. I didn't know what to do. On one hand, I felt insulted, humiliated, rejected. On the other hand, I still loved my friends, and the thought of losing them because of some misunderstanding drove me crazy. But deep down, I knew that this was more than just a misunderstanding. It was something more. And despite all the pain, I understood that my protection and self-respect were more important than building false bridges with people who weren't ready to listen to me. One day when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I received a message from Anton. He wrote that he wanted to meet and talk. At first I was scared, and I felt a surge of anxiety rising inside me. Did he really want to apologize? Or would this be another attempt to blame me? I didn't have the strength to stand up for my dignity again, but I realized that this might be my last chance to change something. I agreed to meet him, but the whole journey there was torture. Hundreds of thoughts were spinning in my head, and I couldn't concentrate. I didn't know what he would say, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to listen to him. But one thought wouldn't leave me. I had to try. I had to restore some justice in my eyes. We met at a cafe. I noticed that Anton looked tense and his gaze was avoidant. He did not meet my gaze, which immediately alerted me. I tried to start a conversation, but he immediately interrupted me, saying that all this is not as I think. He said that Molly's worried, that she feels insecure, and that she perceives my messages as signals. He said that I need to understand that she has her own issues and she is reacting this way because of her past trauma. I listened to him and felt my chest tighten. I realized that he was justifying her actions, even though he knew exactly how things were. He knew that I had always been respectful, that I had never overstepped my boundaries, and that my intentions had never been against their relationship. But instead of taking my side, he chose to support her. Molly was his partner, and he felt he had to protect her. It was understandable, but no less painful. I tried to explain to him that I couldn't control Molly's feelings and that I wasn't responsible for her insecurities. But every time I tried to explain my point of view, Anton responded that maybe I didn't understand how my actions could be perceived. He kept saying that she was worried, that it wasn't her fault. And then I realized that I simply couldn't convince him that I was right. It was more important to him to support his girlfriend than to take the side of a friend who found himself in the role of the accused, innocent, but ostracized. It was a blow I hadn't expected. I sat in silence, feeling each word from his lips dig deeper into my heart. I couldn't respond. Words wouldn't come because I knew I had nothing to say. Everything I tried to explain seemed pointless. I knew that if I were in his shoes, I would support him. But now he was on Molly's side, and my entire attempt to prove my innocence fell into the void. I was terrified that this situation would lead to me losing everyone. I tried to keep myself together, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing control. I couldn't understand why I, trying to be honest and open, had ended up in this situation. I was willing to accept responsibility for my actions, but in this case, I didn't feel like there was anything to apologize for. It had never been so hard to feel like your own friends were starting to look at you like a stranger. Even at that moment, sitting across from Anton, I knew there was already a gap between us that would never be filled. We could no longer be the same as we had been before. After the conversation ended, I left without waiting for any closure. I couldn't stand another minute of this conversation that hadn't led to a solution. But inside me, it was clear. No matter what he said, I couldn't get back what I had lost. Everything that was happening between me, Anton, and Molly did not go unnoticed by our other mutual friends. We had all known each other for a long time, and for most of us, it was not just communication, but a real friendship in which we shared all the important moments of our lives. But now that the situation has become so tense, many began to show their discontent, uncertainty, and, as it seemed to me, pressure. I remember how one day, at a regular meeting, our mutual friends began to cautiously raise the topic of what was happening between me and Anton. You could see the worry in their eyes. They didn't understand what exactly had happened, but they already felt that the tension was growing. Some even approached me with questions, trying to understand the situation, but I couldn't find the right words to explain everything. I couldn't tell them that I was not guilty. I couldn't show them that I had always been sincere and honest. I just felt that they no longer saw me as I used to be. One of the most poignant moments was when one of my friends, with whom I was close, suggested that I talk to Molly and Anton. She said that I should give them a chance to explain themselves, that maybe they just didn't understand the whole situation, and that I needed to be open to talking. I tried to explain to her that I had already tried to do this, and that it was useless, but she kept insisting that if I didn't fight for this friendship, I would lose not only them, but also other people in our circle. Then I felt an even greater burden on my shoulders. I understood that my actions, my decisions now had an impact on the entire group. I couldn't just distance myself from everything. I couldn't refuse to communicate with these people because they were part of my life, part of the world that I had built around myself. But at the same time, I could no longer ignore the fact that the people I considered friends couldn't understand me. They couldn't understand that the most important thing for me was my inner peace, my psycho-emotional safety. Before I knew it, new conversations began to emerge, with the same people discussing my actions and reactions. It became clear to me that not only Anton and Molly, but everyone around me was beginning to perceive this situation through the prism of their own personal experiences. They, like me, were worried, but in their own way. I understood that they were all worried and trying to help, but it didn't help me. On the contrary, it created a feeling that I was somehow obligated to explain something, to justify something. It was a real challenge for me. I started to feel the pressure from those around me growing. My friends didn't understand that I wasn't ready to have these conversations. They insisted that I continue to communicate with Anton and Molly, that I forgive them, that I take a step forward. But it was difficult for me. I felt my soul shrinking when I had to face a lot of looks, a lot of expectations that didn't match what I really felt. Every time I heard words like, "You should talk," "This can all be resolved," "All your problems are a misunderstanding," it became even harder for me. I couldn't explain that for me it wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was something much deeper and more painful. I felt like they couldn't understand why it was so important for me to be safe, emotionally balanced. I felt like I was drifting away from them, like we weren't on the same page anymore. But the hardest part was realizing that these friends who had supported me throughout this whole time now had some kind of responsibility to keep the peace in the group. They felt uncomfortable, not knowing whose side to take. And although none of them said it to me directly, I could see how they divided their loyalties. Some supported Anton and Molly, others tried to be neutral, and only a few remained on my side. But even those who were on my side couldn't understand how deeply this hurt me. At some point, I felt like I was losing everything I had ever considered important. I couldn't decide what to do. I felt like my connection with these people was starting to crumble, and I couldn't stop it. The understanding that for them, my feelings, my experiences had become something they just had to come to terms with so that everything would become normal again, depressed me. Oddly enough, the hardest part wasn't the rejection I felt from Anton and Molly, but the rejection I felt from my friends. And that feeling was even more painful for me than the whole conflict with the couple. It was as if I had lost both those who had always supported me and the relationships that had once been my support. Now they themselves were as if eclipsed, as if they didn't know what to do with me. I became increasingly aware that this pressure was making me feel out of place, that it was tearing me apart from the inside. And at some point I realized that in these circumstances, it would be easier for me to simply avoid meeting them. After the situation with Molly and Anton became unbearable, I began to realize that avoidance was not the answer. It would certainly make me feel better, but I knew that I needed to resolve the conflict somehow if I was going to regain some sense of normalcy in my life. I felt inside that if I didn't take steps to meet them halfway, I would lose not only this couple, but many other people with whom we had been friends for a long time. This feeling that I might lose something that was dear to me became the catalyst for me to make the decision to try something. I decided that I needed to take action, but I also wanted to find a balance so that I wouldn't lose myself. It was incredibly difficult. I was hurt by what was happening and how they were starting to perceive me. But I knew that in this situation, I could either fight for this friendship or walk away completely. And I wasn't ready to just give up everything we had built over the years. The first step was to try to talk to Anton. We had once been close friends, and I couldn't forget the times we had supported each other when he was there for me during difficult times. And it was important for me to reconnect if possible. I knew it was hard for him too, being between me and Molly, but that didn't give him the right to behave the way he did. However, when I approached him, I realized that the situation was more complicated than I had imagined. We sat together and I tried to explain that everything that was happening was the result of misunderstandings and unfair accusations. I tried to convey to him that I did not want to ruin his relationship with Molly, but I also could not continue to be part of a situation in which I was accused of something I did not do. I told him about my experiences, about how difficult it was for me when my friends and acquaintances began to look at me as the one who was ruining the relationship. I tried to convey to him that it was very important for me to feel supported by my friends and not to be accused without any basis. In response, I heard words from him that seemed to be supposed to comfort me, but they did not bring me relief. He said that he understood my feelings and that he saw how hard it was for me right now. However, despite his words, I felt that he was still on Molly's side. He said that she needed help, that she was worried about the past, and that I should be more tolerant and careful in my actions. I could not understand how he could completely ignore my situation and put everything on the line in order to protect her feelings. Then I realized that this whole conversation was just another reminder of how he now viewed me. He didn't see my pain and worries as important. He only saw her worries. It hurt me. I sat down, fell silent, and just didn't know what to say. The words I had been preparing for so long didn't make sense. I realized that I couldn't have the same conversation with this person I considered a friend anymore. His view of the situation was so one-sided that my entire internal struggle with him made no sense. I felt the pressure building inside me. I knew I was at a crossroads. I didn't want to lose everyone I cared about, but I couldn't stay in this cycle where everything I did and said was distorted. I felt like I needed to take one more step for my peace of mind, and that step wasn't about continuing to fight for justice, but about making the decision to let go. After talking to Anton, I decided to give myself time to process everything that had happened. I couldn't be the one to try to prove I was right when it didn't change anything, but at the same time, I couldn't leave things as they were. I needed to distance myself, but do it with dignity, not with resentment, but with the understanding that I can only control my actions and my reactions. But that doesn't mean I have to accept that I'm being unfairly accused. Then I started to stop going to the gatherings where all our mutual friends usually gathered. I didn't want to fight. I didn't want to be the cause of disagreements, but at the same time, it was important to me that they knew that I couldn't continue to be in this situation where I was being accused without any basis. I stopped responding to invitations and began to limit my communication with those who continued to support this strange situation. For a while, I felt better. I felt that although I was losing connections, I was maintaining my internal integrity. After I began distancing myself from Anton, Molly, and other friends, it became clear to me that the situation was not going to resolve itself. I realized that remaining in a state of alienation and avoidance was unlikely to bring me the relief I was looking for. Although it was difficult, I knew that sooner or later I would have to do something to try to reconnect. Not to return to the old naive friendships, but to prevent this situation from completely ruining my relationships with people with whom I had been through a lot. In the end, I decided that if I continued to avoid everyone, this problem would never be solved and I would live in isolation. The understanding that I was missing communication with people I was close to and that the lack of reconciliation would at some point lead to internal conflict became a decisive factor for me. I knew that I would probably lose part of this friendship, but if I did not try to take a step forward, I would suffer from resentment and unsaid things. Moreover, it became clear to me that Anton and Molly weren't the only ones who were part of this tension. My silence and distancing were making other friends uneasy, and I began to notice that I was the topic of conversation at meetings. Some would ask why I didn't show up. Others would try to persuade me to come back and talk to them, but I still couldn't find the strength. The conversations I heard about myself only increased the feeling of loneliness. I needed to do something to free myself from this painful silence. One day, sitting in my apartment, I made a decision. I would write a letter in which I would lay out everything that had accumulated in my soul without accusations or claims. I did not want to create a conflict. I wanted to make it clear that everything I had experienced was traumatic for me. I decided that this step would be a kind of attempt to improve the relationship, but also a way to reserve the right to personal boundaries and respect. I spent hours writing a letter that honestly expressed my feelings. I didn't blame them or try to manipulate them. I simply said that it had become impossible for me to be part of this group when every move I made and every word I said could be twisted. I said how much it hurt me that Anton had sided with Molly when I was his friend, and how hard it was for me to know that no one had tried to understand the situation before jumping to conclusions. I explained how much I needed time to process everything that was happening and find the strength to rebuild myself. When the letter was ready, I felt a mixture of relief and fear. What if this letter only made things worse? What if they perceived it as an attempt at manipulation or weakness on my part? But I knew that if I didn't take this step, I would suffer from my own silence and inner tension. I sent a letter to several people in our circle, hoping it would be the first step toward opening a dialogue. In it, I also offered to meet and talk in person if they wanted to get to the bottom of what had happened. It took a few days before I heard back. I expected some people to react with disbelief or even hurt. However, it turned out that this step opened the door to a frank conversation. Some people in our circle agreed to meet and discuss everything that had happened. And although I was still worried, I felt better knowing that I was no longer alone in this situation. When we met, all conversations were polite and constructive. It was important not to blame each other, but to try to understand the reasons for what was happening. We talked about how easy it was to get trapped in misunderstandings, how difficult it was to maintain normal relationships when each of us was carrying our own experiences. I realized that they also felt their share of guilt for what was happening, and although they did not all fully share my point of view, I saw that they were ready to change. For me, it was a victory. Although I didn't expect things to go back to normal, I felt like this conversation was an important step toward healing. I also learned that I can't expect everyone to understand me the same way, but I can choose how I respond to what's happening. It was a difficult decision, but it was an important step in my recovery. I learned that honesty and openness are what can make a difference, even if the results aren't always what you expected. When everything that had happened finally started to sink in, I realized that I was faced with the task of not only reconnecting, but also figuring out what I really needed from these friendships and these people. My decision was not just about getting back together, but also about learning to live with what had happened so that I wouldn't carry it around as a burden, but rather as a lesson. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that relationships that don't support your self-esteem can't be the basis for a true friendship. However, I still couldn't ignore the fact that I was attached to these people, to these moments in my life, and I needed to figure out how to move forward. After I sent the letter and met with those who agreed to talk, the relationships in the group became a little easier. I felt that the topic was no longer hanging in the air, and although I could not expect all connections to be restored immediately, this was the first step to restoring respect and understanding. But there was one but. Although some people admitted that their behavior was not entirely adequate, and they did not understand all the consequences of their actions, I still had uncertainty about the future. Could I really continue to communicate with them, knowing that I had once been hurt so badly? Could my friends really return to the comfort zone we once shared? I knew that a lot depended on me. I could choose to keep my distance and let this circle of friends go, but at the same time, I knew that if I didn't try to rebuild at least some of these relationships, I would end up alone. I couldn't afford that. After several meetings and frank conversations, it became clear to me that the tension had not disappeared completely, but it had become more manageable. Everything that happened gave me the understanding that there are no ideal relationships and no ideal people. Each of us has our own shortcomings, fears, and vulnerabilities, and perhaps this is what makes us real people. But it was important to learn to understand where your boundaries end and someone else's behavior begins, where you can forgive and where you need to put an end to it. I began to realize that a lot depends on how I perceive this situation. Friendship is not always a perfect relationship. It is an understanding that everyone has the right to their own mistakes, their own experiences, and that you cannot bear the full weight of other people's decisions. I could not change the past, but I could change my reaction to it. Gradually, I was able to accept that I didn't have to go back to the same relationships with those who had hurt me. I shouldn't expect things to be the same because they wouldn't be, but I could make decisions that best serve my well-being and inner peace. Maintaining my inner peace was the most important thing to me, even if it meant leaving some people behind. However, once I decided to leave the past behind, I began to build new boundaries for myself. I learned to discern which people were willing to respect my feelings and support me, and which were not. Reconciliation does not always mean going back to the same place where everything was, but it can be a step toward a new relationship where respect and honesty become the basis of interaction. I realized that while the situation with Anton and Molly had changed everything I thought about friendship, it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. I had learned to be more mindful of my feelings and needs, and I no longer allowed myself to be held hostage to others' expectations or manipulations. Every day I became more and more confident in my right to distance and my boundaries. I realized that despite the severity of what I had experienced, I could retain the ability to love, trust, and open up to new people. But this would only happen when I learned to trust myself and be honest with those around me. Not everything that happened could be forgotten or forgiven so easily, but I realized that letting go of grievances does not mean forgetting. It means that I give myself the opportunity to move on without carrying the burden of other people's mistakes. And although I still have not been able to return to my former circle of friends, I realize that this experience has taught me a lot. It has taught me to value friendships that are built on honesty, mutual respect, and understanding. And although I couldn't go back to the way things were, I felt like I was starting to build a space for myself that would accommodate new people, new perspectives, new opportunities. I believe that in the future, I would be able to surround myself with people who would be open to genuine and honest relationships, where there would be no room for mistrust or accusations. These lessons, though painful, became the foundation for me to move on. I accepted that the world is not always perfect and that friendship is not just words, but actions. And now I was ready to move forward, confident that there would be many people in my life with whom I could build new relationships that valued honesty and mutual respect. The moments I experienced became a part of me, but they no longer defined me. I stopped being afraid of loss and began to appreciate what I had. And although the road was not easy, I knew that I was ready to move forward, no matter what. Story 3. The warm June night wrapped me like a soft blanket, immersing me in the quiet of Wyoming's eastern plains. The stars seemed to be watching me, their glow so bright that I felt as if I could lose myself in the vastness of space. I've always loved being in such vast places, when all life around me disappears and there's only you and the endless sky. And I knew that this night would be another in a series of quiet, almost sacred moments, when you fully feel your smallness in the face of the greatness of the world. I sat by the fire with Jeremiah and Pete, all 3 ranchers who had grown up on the land. Larry, Jeremiah, and I sat there at night, enjoying the simple pleasures of the stars and this moment of silence. We had set up camp to spend a night away from it all, surrounded by the vastness and silence that was familiar and intimate. We had packed enough food to leave for a few days on our own, but that didn't seem to matter right now. We just wanted to feel a part of this world, under this big sky. Like invisible ancient spirits, the winds of the evening steppe carried with them the sense of the earth dried by the sun and the freshness with which it was filled at night. This world was ancient, and although we had lived here for only a few years, I felt how long ago we had become part of it. In every step, in every breath, there was affection, something that could not be expressed in words, as if these lands knew us, and we knew them. There were no unnecessary words, no fuss. There was simply the present. As the fire began to fade, we sat in the shadow of the flames, but in that silence, the stars filled the space with light, bright and powerful as never before. The silence was a canvas on which each of us painted our thoughts. We were cowboys, but when Jeremiah, Pete, and I first asked ourselves that question, I didn't know how to answer it. We were all born here, and each had his own story about his ancestors. But how could we be cowboys in the true sense of the word? I shuddered as I thought about it, and suddenly I felt the stars watching us, as if they were watching our thoughts. We had grown up among men who called themselves cowboys, but what did that mean to us? We weren't like those who rode the vast plains in search of adventure or gold. We simply lived, working the ranch, farming the land, raising cattle. And yet the question rang in my mind. What was it to be a cowboy if you weren't traveling, fighting for freedom, or struggling to find your own way? It had been a hard day at the ranch, but there was nothing we enjoyed more than setting out at night into the vastness of the wilderness, leaving the day behind. Here in camp, under the stars, where all the silence seemed charged with some ancient meaning, we searched for answers. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that each of us had our own version of what it meant to be a cowboy. Jeremiah had said that we were all from this land, and that meant something to us. We were truly part of this land. We were cowboys, simple, real, connected to nature. My hand squeezed the edge of the map I had pulled out of my backpack, and I tried to imagine the very roads that the first settlers, the first cowboys who discovered these lands, had once walked. The path was hard, but these were the people who created our lands. I remembered conversations with my grandfather, who had told me stories many times about how my ancestors had once fought for the land, in search of a better life, despite all the difficulties. He did not call them cowboys, but they were the ones who were looking for freedom and independence. Now, looking up at the vast sky, I realized that we may have been cowboys, but in a completely different way than I had imagined. We weren't looking for gold. We weren't trying to conquer this land. We were simply living here, working with the land and the animals, respecting nature, and preserving its beauty. Jeremiah once said that we had to be connected to this time, to this world, because we grew up here, in this place, and our lives were part of what happened in these vast spaces so many years ago. He spoke of family, of great-grandparents who had walked the same path as us, and I felt those words pierce me. In this world, we were just small parts of something much larger. Pete suddenly said that our ancestors were part of the same time when cowboys made their way across America. We looked at the stars, and I felt the emptiness of the night fill me. The stars were so bright that I could see them reflected in the eyes of our horses standing next to the fire. The silence of the night became almost sacred, and I felt this place, this world becoming an integral part of me. I knew that we were simply the heirs of what had been here before us, that despite the changing times, we were still tied to this land, as our ancestors had been. As I looked at this world, I realized that our life on these plains was connected to what had happened before, and perhaps that was why cowboy life seemed so familiar and close to us. We were part of something that no longer existed, but had left its mark on us. Morning came when the first rays of the sun barely touched the horizon, illuminating the land with a soft orange light. The sun was bright, but not scorching, as on hot summer days. The sky was still covered with a light morning haze, and the air was fresh, full of the smell of dew and wild grass. I woke up, feeling how my body, tired from the night of reflections by the fire, was gradually coming to its senses. Jeremiah and Pete were already on their feet. As always, first thing in the morning, they moved calmly and confidently, as if they were part of this world, no different from its silent, sturdy trees and restless animals. The fire in the camp had already died down, and the smoke from the fire was still hanging in the air. But with each passing moment, it was disappearing, dissolving into the morning coolness. I stood up and stretched, feeling my muscles ache slightly from the night's rest on the ground. Despite this, I could not shake the feeling that here, in this silence and solitude, I was exactly where I needed to be. Breakfast was simple, like everything here. The same bread, some cheese, a few boiled eggs. We never sought excess, and we could not afford it. We were here to work and live by the laws that had long existed in this land. If someone from the outside had looked at us, they might not have understood the whole point, but we knew that life here was meaningless without work and dedication. After breakfast, we headed toward the camp. The wind stirred the grass slightly, and I saw several horses grazing nearby raise their heads, their ears alert. They were part of us, like the world, with its wild spaces and strange rules that never seemed to change. We walked to our horses, each of us tending to his own mate, Jeremiah to his black horse, Pete to his straw-colored steed. I walked up to my own, who stood with his eyes fixed, attentive and calm, as if he had been a part of this place as much as we were. The work that day seemed especially difficult. The sun rose higher and higher in the sky, filling the earth with a heat that began to sap strength. The sand under my fingernails, the sweat running down my face, it all seemed normal, part of the daily routine. But there was something special about this morning. I increasingly felt the earth and air surrounding me, as if this work were not just labor, but part of something greater, something eternal. We moved along the land, checking the corral where the cattle were kept. Everything was as it should be, only a little quieter than usual. I noticed that Jeremiah was a little too quiet, his eyes distant, as if he was expecting something. Pete was also preoccupied with his thoughts. I couldn't figure out what it was, but there was something uneasy about their silence. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of unease was becoming more and more palpable. The wind had picked up, and it seemed as if something was changing in the air. I felt the ground beneath my feet become heavier, as if something invisible was holding it down, pressing it down. At that moment, I felt a strange sensation, as if someone was watching us. I looked around but saw nothing, only empty space, the silence of the steppe in the distant mountains on the horizon. But inside me, this feeling did not leave. I did not know what it meant, but there was something in this silence that made me feel like a stranger in this place. We continued to work, but more and more often I looked at the sky and around. Jeremiah and Pete were wary too. Nothing was happening, but we sensed that something was wrong. When we were done with the corral, we headed back to camp. It was late afternoon, and I could feel the cool of the evening creeping into my body as the sun began to dip below the horizon. We sat by the fire, silent. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but it wouldn't go away. At that moment, Pete pulled an old map out of his pack and began to unfold it. Jeremiah, without saying a word, walked over and looked at the map. He pointed to a spot where there seemed to be an old pool that hadn't been there in years. We had never noticed anything unusual about this place, but I felt like we were on the cusp of something important. At that moment, the wind changed its trajectory again. It became stronger and colder, with an unnatural smell that I could not understand. I felt my body tighten, as if ready for action. I did not know what to do, but inside me, the thought stirred that everything that was happening around me was only part of something much larger. Night came slowly, swallowing the world around me, and I felt the silence growing thicker. A light night wind stirred the leaves of the trees, but the camp felt menacing, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. That strange chill I had felt earlier did not go away. It was not the kind of chill that comes from a change in temperature, but something that seemed to penetrate my soul, to envelop my thoughts and feelings. I could not explain why, but this evening was different. Something was wrong. We sat by the fire, but the fire seemed unable to warm us, its flames dancing but not radiating the familiar warmth. I caught Jeremiah and Pete's eyes, and they felt it too. Neither of us spoke, but the silence between us was heavy, almost physical. We all tried to hide our discomfort, but I was certain that we could not escape what was coming. When the sun disappears behind the horizon, the world around us begins to change. This is the time when the shadows become long and dark, and sounds make strange, barely perceptible notes. This is not the silence I am used to. Here, in the dense forest, the night lived its own life, and I knew that it kept us under its control. I stood up and walked to the edge of the camp beyond the firelight. The darkness was all around me, but I wasn't afraid. I couldn't explain why, but it didn't feel like the darkness was threatening me. It felt like it was embracing me, as if waiting for me to take the next step. And maybe that step wasn't random, because something in the forest had been waiting for this exact moment. There was a rustling in the bushes nearby, and I felt my heart beat faster. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I wasn't alone. I turned and saw Pete and Jeremiah standing up too, each of us moving silently toward the sound. The horses nearby began to turn their heads anxiously, and I could feel their tension. That feeling, when everyone around you becomes wary, as if they sense something terrible is about to happen, was coming over me too. We approached the bushes cautiously, feeling the night tighten its grip on us with every step. Suddenly, in the shadows, I saw a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the light. It was almost invisible, as if it were dissolving into the darkness, but something in its movement made my heart beat in my chest. Fear began to seep into my thoughts, but I forced myself not to take a single unnecessary step. I glanced back at Jeremiah and Pete. They were both looking at me with expressions like they were ready to act. We hadn't discussed a plan. We just knew what we had to do. But when I looked back at the figure in the dark, it had started moving toward us, leisurely, like it had all the time in the world. Each step the figure took caused the air to become thicker, and I could feel something gathering around us that was impossible to describe in words. The night wasn't just dark, it was eerie. I couldn't hold on any longer. Forces I didn't understand were forcing me forward, even though I knew I shouldn't. As the figure approached, I realized it was not a man. It was not someone who could be among us. The being standing before us had a strange shape, unlike anything I had ever encountered. It was tall, its outlines indistinct, as if it were a mass of night. I wanted to take a step back, but something held me back. The being was looking at us, and there was something so strange and frightening in its gaze that I could not look away. It wasn't the fear that comes with danger. It was the fear of knowing you're up against something you can't explain. And maybe that fear was worse than the threat itself. The thing didn't move. We stood facing each other, and I felt the air around us grow thicker, the night itself shrinking around this encounter. Silently, we watched as it began to dissolve into the darkness, disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. But I knew one thing. It was not gone. It simply returned to the shadows, to the very depths of the shadows, where we could not see it, but it continued to watch us. Several days passed, but the feeling did not leave me. I would often wake up in the middle of the night, feeling that something was watching me, like there was a shadow in the darkness that was haunting me. I couldn't explain why the feeling was so real, why it felt so intense. Jeremiah and Pete didn't talk about what had happened, but I knew they hadn't forgotten about the encounter either. We continued to work as usual, but there was an invisible weight between us. The camp was quiet, as if all of nature around us had frozen in anticipation. The wind did not rustle the leaves, and the animals avoided our presence, hiding somewhere deep in the forest. I could not help but think that this was only the beginning of something much more disturbing. And although we did not say it out loud, we sensed that this place had attracted us for a reason. It concealed something we had not yet encountered. One evening, as the day was fading and the shadows of night were gathering, we found ourselves back by the fire, but not as we had been before. We sat in silence, each absorbed in his own thoughts. Pete was especially quiet, his gaze piercing the darkness, as if he were searching for something deep in the woods, something we couldn't see. Jeremiah seemed lost in his own thoughts, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. It was as if his thoughts were so far away that he didn't even notice us sitting there. And then, one evening, when darkness had swallowed the world around me, I felt that same cold again. It was not strong, but it was as real as everything that was happening around me. I stood up, deciding to check if something had attracted my attention, and headed towards the forest. The horses were standing still, but even they seemed wary, as if something was happening in the dark depths on which their gaze could not focus. My steps were quiet, almost inaudible on the soft ground, but I felt the tension growing with each step. I didn't know what was troubling me, but I knew I couldn't just sit and wait. I needed to find out what was hidden in this forest, in these old empty places. Suddenly I felt a light breeze touch my skin, and then another. But this one was strangely cold. It was pulling not only the sense of the forest, but also something else, elusive, like a shadow moving in the darkness. I stopped, alerted, and at that moment a figure appeared for a moment. No, it was not a creature, like that time, but still something unusual. The figure moved, but in a way that seemed to be part of the darkness itself. I couldn't understand how it was possible, but it was real. It wasn't a person or an animal. It was more than I could have imagined. I felt the air around me become even thicker, as if I were in some other world, detached from reality. The creature, or whatever it was getting closer, and I didn't know what to do anymore. Every step I took toward the figure felt wrong, but I couldn't turn back. I took a step forward, but as I approached, the figure disappeared, as if it had dissolved into the darkness. And although I could not understand what had happened, there remained within me a strange feeling that I was on the brink of something much greater. That night when I returned to camp, I noticed Jeremiah and Pete watching me silently. We all knew that what was happening was not a coincidence. We were part of something bigger, something we couldn't fully comprehend. Over the next few days, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The forest seemed increasingly alien, and we began to notice strange things more and more often, as if someone or something was watching us, appearing and disappearing in dark corners where we couldn't see. Every evening we gathered around the fire, but the silence did not seem so comfortable. We could not speak of what was happening, but each of us felt that this forest, this place, had us in its power. And until we learned what was hidden behind its dark corners, there would be no peace for us or this place. I knew one thing: we couldn't leave without knowing the truth, and that knowledge haunted me like an inescapable nightmare that wouldn't let go, despite our efforts to ignore it. Time passed, and the camp became more and more uncomfortable. We continued to work, but this strange tension between us did not disappear. The forest was like a living creature. It was watching us, absorbing our every step, our every movement. We all understood that the place where we were now was not ordinary. Something in this forest did not give us peace. One day, as we were walking back from a day's work, I noticed that Pete was walking a little behind. He was not himself. His eyes were clouded, and his face was unnatural. Jeremiah noticed this, and we both tried to get him to talk, but he answered nonsensically as if he did not realize what was happening. We brought him to the camp and sat him down by the fire, but his eyes never left the forest, as if he saw something we could not see. There was something strange in his gaze, something uneasy. Soon he said quietly, "He was there, in the forest. He was watching me." I didn't know what he meant, but my insides tightened. We didn't say it out loud, but we each sensed that this wasn't just Pete's imagination. The forest wasn't what it used to be. It seemed to be swallowing us up. As the night wore on, his condition worsened. He could not calm down. His eyes continued to dart restlessly into the dark corners of the forest. We decided that he needed to rest and settled him in one of the tents to calm down. Jeremiah and I remained by the fire, but there was no conversation. The silence grew thicker, and a strange cold permeated everything around us. All night long, I couldn't stop thinking about what Pete had said. I couldn't figure out what he'd seen, but his words wouldn't leave my head. He wasn't mentally unstable, and I knew what he was experiencing was real, at least to him. But something inside me resisted the thought of what was happening in those woods. It was too strange, too incomprehensible. The night was long, and it was not until morning that I was able to get some sleep, but it brought no relief. When I awoke, I saw Jeremiah standing at the edge of the camp, looking into the dark forest. He did not move, did not make a sound, but his eyes were fixed on something deep in the forest. I stood up and walked towards him, but he didn't notice me. When I got closer, he finally spoke. "Do you feel it? It's something here, with us." I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't understand what he was feeling, but I was beginning to feel something similar. That same heaviness that was becoming more and more unbearable with each passing day. "It's not just fear," he continued. "It's something bigger, something that never leaves these forests. I didn't know what to say. We all knew we were in a place that had a life of its own, a place that wouldn't leave people alone. It felt like a dead end, a place we were in now, and every day we were there brought us closer to the inevitable. Jeremiah turned to me and said, "We need to get out of here." I nodded silently. We both knew we couldn't just leave, but the decision was clear. We couldn't afford to stay here. In this forest full of misty threats, we felt like we were risking more than just our lives by staying. But it all seemed too late. Just as we were getting ready, I noticed a figure flashing in the shadows between the trees. I didn't have time to focus on it, but it was there, in the forest next to us. I felt something stir inside me, as if my body was being lifted by some invisible force. We couldn't leave the camp. We couldn't leave until we knew what exactly was lurking in these woods. Our actions couldn't be as simple as always. Suddenly, Pete showed up at the camp. He looked better than before, but he still wasn't himself. His eyes were different. Even his gaze became empty, as if he no longer belonged to this world. "He won't leave," he said, and his words left no room for doubt. "We are all here forever." I realized then that we had not simply encountered something supernatural. We had become part of this forest. And in this shadow, in this waiting, in this abyss, we remained locked. Maybe I realized too late that we were not here by chance. Every day in this camp, every moment in the forest, was drawing us deeper into something I could not fully comprehend. It was not by chance that we were here, nor by chance that we had stumbled upon this place. In something terrible and inevitable, I felt it consuming us. Several days had passed since the last strange incident, but there was no peace. The tension did not leave us, despite our attempts to ignore what was happening around us. The forest continued to be in our minds, filling every corner with dark thoughts and disturbing premonitions. I began to notice how our camp was losing its former protection. Everything seemed the same, but at the same time, something was changing. The forest was becoming more threatening, darker. It was no longer just a natural setting. It was a part of us, a part of this history, parts of which we could never forget. I stopped more and more often listening. Something rustled in the grass, branches crackled, but everything was too quiet. Sometimes I thought that in the forest, not only the sounds but the silence itself became unbearable. Even when we sat by the fire, it seemed to me that someone was watching us from the dark trees. Someone or something. We tried to search the forest for answers, but with each passing day we realized more and more that they were not given to us. Pete, who had seemed perfectly healthy just a few days before, was now becoming more and more strange. His eyes were empty, he did not see us, and his behavior became more and more withdrawn. With each step he took, I felt him moving away, something in him disappearing, and a part of us leaving with him. As I walked through the camp, I felt something touch my shoulder, but no one was there. I knew that the forest could be too smart, that it could interact with us as pawns, leading us as it wished. But I was too tired to realize it, too foggy in my head to believe in such things. I kept going forward, step by step, hoping that this feeling of anxiety would go away. But it only grew stronger. A few more days passed and Pete withdrew completely. I tried to talk to him, but he no longer responded, only sat in his corner of the camp, as if frozen in some nightmare. I felt that he didn't need to say anything. It was clear. He was no longer with us. Jeremiah had changed noticeably too. His face had become grim, as if he were carrying a shadow, something heavy and endless. He often went into the woods alone, and I couldn't understand why. What was he looking for there? I was sure he had been shown something like Pete, but he couldn't or wouldn't tell me. This forest, this shadow, they took us one by one, without exception. One night when I woke up with a strange feeling, I walked out of my tent. The forest was dark, and I felt its cold breath catch me. It was not like an ordinary night. I saw dark shapes moving between the trees, although nothing was actually moving. Something was rising inside me, and I did not know what it was. A shiver down my spine, doubt, fear, or all at once? When I returned to the fire, Jeremiah was already sitting there, alone, lost in dark thoughts. His eyes were staring into space, and I realized that he felt it too. We all felt it, but none of us could admit to ourselves that we had gone too far to return. The forest was not just a place where we stopped. It was a watcher, and it saw us. It saw everything. It watched us leave, and now it held us captive. Everything we did, everything we experienced, was written in a language we could not understand. We didn't talk about leaving anymore. We didn't talk about what happened to Pete anymore. We didn't talk about what was happening in that forest anymore, because every day, every moment in that place showed us that we couldn't leave it anymore. We became a part of this place, and the longer we stayed here, the clearer it became that we would never leave alive. Everything around me seemed frozen in time. I walked around the camp, but I didn't know what I was looking for. The forest was still full of threats and strange sounds, but now I had a hard time even concentrating. I felt like I was in a void where every movement was meaningless. It all started when I noticed Pete disappearing into the forest more and more often. He would leave and not return for long periods of time. Even when we tried to find him, nothing helped. The forest was absorbing him as if he was becoming a part of it, dissolving into this endless green ocean. We knew it wasn't normal, but we couldn't stop. The forest was pulling us, and we followed it like blind people. There was no point to what was happening. We were still trying to support each other, but the oppressive atmosphere that was beginning to fill every corner of the camp was paralyzing us. I couldn't help but notice how Jeremiah's eyes were becoming empty. His movements were slow and frozen. It was as if he was no longer himself. I myself felt like I was losing something important, something that gave me the strength to live, and that something was disappearing with every step in this damn forest. Time was losing its meaning. We were captives of this place, but we couldn't even fully comprehend it. We continued to live out of habit from one day to the next, not realizing that everything had long since gotten out of control. The forest was no longer just a forest. It was something more, something that defied understanding. I woke up at night with the feeling that something was nearby. Something was watching us. But as soon as I opened my eyes, there was nothing. Only this insatiable and endless forest that continued to crawl through the night, stretching its roots straight into our hearts. One night, deciding I couldn't stay in this place any longer, I took a flashlight and went looking for Pete. I had to get him back, or at least figure out what was happening. The forest seemed to respond to my steps, casting its shadows to confuse me. But I kept going, and the further I went into the forest, the more it felt like it was swallowing me up. I knew that if I didn't stop, I would disappear along with it, but it was impossible to stop. I remembered how the forest had once been just a forest, a regular forest. I could have walked through it dozens of times, but now every step felt heavy, unnatural. Everything around me felt different. The trees bent as if they were watching me, and the ground beneath my feet felt sticky, as if it were trying to hold me up. After a while, I saw him, Pete. He was standing by the trees staring into space. His body was motionless, like a puppet controlled by someone invisible. When I approached, he didn't notice me. And then I realized that Pete was no longer who he had been before. He was part of this forest, part of something that couldn't be understood, but was very real. That moment was like a revelation. I tried to call out to him, but at that moment the forest became even darker. It was as if this place did not want me to leave it. Fear washed over me like a wave, and I suddenly realized that everything I had tried to understand no longer made sense. We weren't just in the forest, we were trapped. I walked back to the camp, and everyone was quiet. We sat around the fire, and although I couldn't explain what had happened to me, I knew that we had all become part of this place. Pete was gone, and now he was gone. Jeremiah was still sitting in his corner, motionless, but I knew he was no longer the same person we had come here with. The forest continued its endless cycle, but now I knew we could not leave it. We were part of it, and our end was predetermined. The dark shapes continued to move around us, but we could no longer find our way back. And if we tried, the forest would swallow us. It always did. Story 4. I stood at the edge of the forest, watching two little girls, Lily and Mia, playing by an old well, enjoying themselves in their little world of innocent joy and carefreeness. Lily, always with a genuine glow on her face, handed Mia a bright flower, perhaps a random gift that she had brought so proudly. Mia snatched it with a smile, and their little hands intertwined, like two echoes of the same heart. I could have stayed in that moment forever, listening to their laughter, to the water murmuring like a river in the distance, and to the birds calling in the air. It seemed that everything I had ever known would be given to me if I could stay here. Only this forest, these children, these sounds. That was all that remained. All that I was lost in the shadows and lost in the peace, in this place where everything seemed possible. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, feeling myself becoming lighter. The forest was my connection to this world, even though I was part of something darker, hidden. Only this forest brought relief and freedom. I heard their voices, their children's laughter, and it seemed that I could dissolve in it. But something inside me restlessly tormented my soul, reminding me that I could never be completely at peace. "Hey, you children, gather around!" The old pharmacist's voice rang out, and suddenly everyone fell silent. I opened my eyes. The old man's call was familiar to everyone, and no one could resist it. Every summer, as always, he gathered the children in the square by the old well, telling the same story, a story I knew as well as he did. But somehow, with each passing year, it became more and more foggy, frightening, and difficult for me. I looked around as I approached the group of children, sitting quietly on the grass, this time unable to resist watching their faces. The children were still full of excitement, eager for the story to begin, though their souls were not yet burdened with knowledge. And me, I sat there tormented by the fact that these words would be repeated again. I did not even know why it tormented me so. After all, the old apothecary himself was part of the very forest that surrounded us. He seemed to know everything about it. The sun was filtering through the dense foliage, casting soft shadows on the ground. A gentle breeze caressed my face, and I felt everything around me grow quiet in anticipation. Even the animals seemed to sense the change in the air. Everything here, nature, the children, and I, was part of something older and more inevitable. The old man sitting across from us exhaled heavily. His eyes were full of wisdom, but with that look there was also a shadow of something deeper, something I had always tried to avoid. I already knew that this inevitable story would soon begin. The story of how an ancient power was born in the forest, and how it settled in the heart of this world. It was hard to comprehend that it was everywhere, in every leaf, every blade of grass, every grain of sand in this place. Once upon a time there lived a man and a woman in a house by the river, he began, his voice slow and sad. I remembered the story as if it were a part of me. We all knew it was not just a fairy tale, but a story about a line that could not be crossed. The old man continued, his words burning into the air to stay in our ears forever. The man and woman, the apothecary said, lived by a river surrounded by barren land, so lifeless and unbearable that even the simplest actions seemed impossible. They lived in perfect harmony, drawing water from the river, protecting it, and trying to maintain life in this harsh, naked world. This world had no place for love, only fear and cruelty reigned here. I remembered how the apothecary always said that the river was something special, as if life itself was in it, as if there was more to its waters than just water. And on the other side of the river, in that barren land, there were creatures that were not like the ones we had met in the forest. These creatures did not know love. Their goal was only to survive. They were like desert trolls, living in sandy caves, creatures that could not understand the human desire for good. The old man paused, looking at our faces, as if testing us, as if checking that we were absorbing these words. But they no longer made sense to me. I knew what would happen next, knew how a man and a woman would face this terrible thing, this troll, and how their love would not be able to defeat it. Knew that this troll was more than a threat. It was something that could not be stopped, something that grew in the dark corners of the forest and followed each of us. But it was too terrible to just sit and listen. I was lost in my thoughts again, feeling the shudder again that the forest that seemed so alive and full was hiding something unimaginably terrible. The old apothecary's words fell on me like a cold stream, and I felt a tightness in my chest. I couldn't forget it, even if I tried. No matter how much I tried to leave it in the past, it always came back. This story was part of my existence, part of my destiny, and I no longer knew how to free myself from it. I wake up early in the morning when the first rays of the sun barely touch the ground, and through the window I see a vague shadow stretching along the forest. The same forest that was my shelter has now become something frightening, as if the very air around me is filled with secrets that I did not dare to solve. I needed to go out there, as always, to those places where I was accustomed to feeling safe. But now I already knew that this safety was only an illusion. The noise in the house was familiar, the soft sounds from the old wardrobe, the creaking of the floorboards under my feet that I could never eliminate. But something was missing. I sat at the table waiting for the morning, all the time peering out the windows, where the forest hid behind the fog, as if beckoning me to come in. In those moments, I wanted to forget everything I knew and believe again that I could be calm. Only for a moment I almost convinced myself of this, but each morning was like a reminder that I could not hide from what was waiting for me out there. The forest. These words sounded in my head like a spell, binding me to this place. I did not know what to do with this knowledge that I could not get rid of. The shadows of the forest seemed to gradually penetrate me, and I felt invisible threads connected to me, as if I was a part of something much larger and darker than I could imagine. I walked through the house, opened the door, and a soft rustling sound, like something disappearing into thin air, immediately caught my ear. I looked around, but noticed nothing. Everything was the same. Only a gentle breeze glided across the grass, playing with the leaves as if in greeting. The sound was familiar and comforting to me, but something about it was alarming, as if it was more than just the wind. It was something more that could not be ignored. My footsteps echoed in the silence as I headed toward the forest, carefully picking my way through familiar paths. The forest seemed to have grown even thicker, its dark branches clinging to me as if unwilling to let go. I had visited these places often and knew every tree, every stone. But now every step in this forest caused me a strange uneasiness. Something elusive lurked in its depths. Suddenly, I noticed a figure appear in the darkness from behind an old oak tree that seemed familiar to me. I stopped, not even trying to breathe. The figure was blurred, almost invisible, but its silhouette was clearly discernible. The shadow seemed to move on its own, without disturbing the peace of everything around it. I peered at it, unable to look away. My heart beat faster, and a chill ran down my spine. What was that? I remembered the words of the apothecary, ancient creatures that live in the forest. These creatures that could never be seen, but were always present in the air, in the trees, in the earth. These were not just shadows, but something much more ancient and dangerous. I took a step forward and the figure disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. My hands grew cold and I felt panic rising inside me. This place was not safe, and I knew it, even though I tried to convince myself otherwise. What I had seen was not just a figment of my imagination. I didn't know what to do, didn't know what awaited me next. But I couldn't leave. This place continued to draw me in, despite all my fears. I took another step and suddenly heard a rustling sound behind me. This time I didn't turn around right away. I knew that, with just one wrong look, everything could disappear like a dissolving shadow, but the sounds were becoming clearer. Someone or something was following me. That was for sure. It wasn't just my imagination. I felt my blood run cold and goosebumps run down my skin. When I turned around, I saw no one. At that moment, I didn't know what was happening, but I was sure that the forest was hiding something important from me. Maybe it wasn't something supernatural, but I knew. These shadows, these sounds, they were part of something I shouldn't have encountered. I stood there in complete silence, not daring to take a single step, but I felt myself being drawn to that place. That place I knew all too well, but now it was different, and I didn't know what to expect from it next time. That day, the forest was unusually quiet. There was no familiar rustling of leaves. Even the air seemed heavy, as if the whole world had frozen in anticipation of something that was about to happen. I walked along a familiar path, but the feeling that something was wrong did not leave me. It seemed that I heard the sound, barely perceptible, almost indistinguishable, as if someone was whispering my name in the very heart of the forest. I stopped and looked out into the dark, gloomy spaces that had once seemed so comfortable and safe. But now everything was different. The forest seemed to open up before me, offering strange and frightening vistas that I hadn't noticed before. I felt that chill down my spine again, like I was being watched. The first signs of change began to appear a few days ago. It all started when I noticed strange tracks in the forest that weren't there before. They were too big to belong to normal animals, and too small to be human. I tried to ignore them, but the strange feeling that I was being watched wouldn't go away. These tracks, hidden in the thick grass and leaves, seemed to be part of something much older than I could have imagined. This wasn't just my imagination, and I knew it. With each step, the feeling grew stronger. I could turn back, go home, forget about it. But standing at the edge of the forest, I felt that I couldn't. Something inside me was pulling me forward, deeper, into the heart of this strange and sinister place. I walked on, despite the growing fear that paralyzed my legs. And so finally, I found myself at the old oak tree. It had been there for so many years that it seemed to be part of the forest itself. Its mighty branches stretched toward the sky, and even against the dense foliage I could feel its strength. This tree had always been special to me, but this time, something was different. I came closer and felt a strange silence around me. It seemed as if the entire forest had frozen, as if it were holding its breath. I touched its bark, and at that moment a wave of strange sensation swept over me. It was as if I felt not only the tree, but also something hidden in its depths, something alive, watching me. My hand shook, and I pulled it away, as if its bark was not just cold, but somehow unnatural. I looked around, trying again to find an explanation for what was happening. The forest, where I had once felt safe, now seemed foreign and threatening. I wanted to turn and leave, but then something caught my attention. On the ground, right in front of me, lay a small object. It was covered in dirt, but upon closer inspection, I realized it was an ancient medallion. I picked it up carefully, feeling the weight in my hands. The medallion was not just a decoration. It was part of something much larger. Its surface was carved with strange symbols that I could not understand, but which felt familiar. It seemed as if they were part of an ancient spell or ritual that I was not supposed to touch. My fingers involuntarily slid over these symbols, and I felt a sharp chill that immediately engulfed my hands. Suddenly, the air around me changed. It became even heavier and the forest seemed to come alive. I could hear the wind rushing through the trees, but now I could hear words in its rustling, almost a whisper, barely audible, but coming from somewhere deep in the forest. I tried to let go of the medallion, but my hands seemed not to obey me. I was paralyzed by this strange sensation that had taken over my body. The shadows of the forest began to move, and I saw a figure appear between the trees. At first it was blurry, almost transparent, but gradually it became clearer. It was something I could not describe in words, a creature that had no definite form, like a shadow but at the same time completely real, faintly glowing, as if it were a creature of the darkness itself. I knew that this was not just my fear, but something truly dangerous lurking in the forest. I felt my heart pounding in my chest and the medallion in my hand began to burn like hot iron. In that moment, I realized that I had not come here by chance. Everything in this forest, everything that had happened, had led me to this moment, and now I was face to face with what was never meant to be revealed. The darkness around me thickened, and the forest seemed to become even more impenetrable. I could not take my eyes off the figure that was getting closer and closer to me. Every movement of this creature was at once smooth and abrupt, as if it did not belong to this world but only materialized here, for a moment, to frighten me to the core. The medallion in my hand continued to burn, and I felt its energy seeping into my body as if it were absorbing my life force. I tried to let go, but my fingers wouldn't obey. I was chained to this object, as if it were a part of me. With each passing moment, I felt the medallion changing me, changing my perception. Too much power, too many dark secrets it hid within itself. The figure, which was getting closer, finally took shape. It looked like a human, but its outline was blurred, as if a shadow were flowing from it, and its face, a face I could not see, was hidden under a hood. I tried to take a step back, but my feet were rooted to the ground, and I could not move. I was like a cornered animal, surrounded by an invisible force, and I knew that I could not escape. The creature stopped right in front of me, and its presence filled the air with a thick stench, as if everything around me had become sullen and dead. I could feel its gaze even though I couldn't see its eyes. It pierced me, making my heart beat faster. I knew it wasn't just looking at me, it was expecting something. At that moment I remembered, it was here next to this oak tree, that I found that medallion. And now it seemed all the events that had happened since that day were connected at one point. The creature in front of me did not just appear out of nowhere. It lived here in the forest, watching me, waiting for me to open that very ancient artifact. "You have not come by chance," it said, and the voice was not human, but rather an echo, reflected in the void. It was deep, misty, and I realized that its words were not directed at me as a person, but rather at my soul, at a part of me that I myself was not aware of. "You are revealing what should have remained hidden long ago," the creature continued, and I felt it penetrate my thoughts, my mind. "This medallion is a key, but a key to what? You are not ready." Not ready? But I didn't know what I was supposed to be ready to understand. It all seemed insane, though I couldn't deny that I was dealing with something supernatural. The forest became even more ominous. Its trees began to bend, as if they were reaching out to us, and the fog that covered the ground was creeping in, obscuring everything around us. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask for help, but the words wouldn't come out. I was trapped, a prisoner of my own decisions. My body tensed, and I felt the medallion's powers begin to drain me of everything that was left. The last of my energy, the last of my strength, the last of my humanity. "You must understand," the creature's voice became clearer, and its words seemed not just words, but something much more significant than any speech. "You have opened more than just an artifact. You have opened a door, and now you must go through it." I felt like something was exploding in my head that I couldn't explain. Visual images, strange symbols, fragments of forgotten memories. All of them flashed through my mind like a movie. I saw faces I'd never met, places I couldn't go to, and sounds that didn't belong in this world. The creature was getting closer, its silhouette no longer blurry. I could now clearly discern its form. It was tall, elongated, with long arms that reached out to me. I felt it taking everything I once knew and replacing it with something else. I couldn't fight it. It was beyond my strength. "You will discover a world long forgotten," the figure said, its voice now a polyphonic echo, like an ancient ritual. "But you must remember that this world is not to be trifled with." And in that moment I realized I had no choice. I couldn't run. I couldn't hide. The forest, the medallion, the creature, everything was connected. Everything was part of something I couldn't understand, and I was here to go through it, to accept my role in this forgotten, dark world that had awakened. I didn't know how much time had passed since the creature had stopped in front of me. It was as if time itself had stood still. Everything around me was still ominous and oppressive, but now there was something different in the air, a sense of inevitability. The forest that had once felt like home was now hostile, filled with unknown forces that could be either an old forgotten evil or part of something far older than I could have imagined. The medallion continued to burn in my hand, and its light seemed brighter and brighter. It was no longer just a decoration. Now it was an artifact, something alive, absorbing my soul, my power. In its light, I saw images from the distant past, from the time when this forest was a place of worship and sacred rites. Flashes of images flew before my eyes, like a disconnected series of frames from an alien world. The creature was silent. Its shadow still reached out to me, as if it expected me to do something. But what? I didn't know what was required of me. Anxiety grew inside me, and with every breath, the forest became more and more alien and incomprehensible. I realized that if I didn't understand what I needed to do, if I didn't uncover this secret, I would never leave this place. You must understand that you are not a random person in this forest, the voice finally rang out. And this time it was clear, as if it came not from the void, but straight from the earth itself, from its heart. The one who wears the medallion is not just a wanderer. He is a link between worlds. My eyes widened. I stood rooted to the spot, unable to move, while I wished I could leave. Meanwhile, the figure before me began to blur, its outlines becoming less defined, as if the shadow itself was trying to adapt to the space, as if it had never truly been a living being. I could feel its shape changing, as if it could take any number of possible forms. It was something other than what I would expect from a being capable of appearing in our world. "You are not alone," the voice said, and in its sound I caught not only a threat, but also something frighteningly familiar. "This medallion belongs to those who came before you, to those who lived in this forest when it was not just a place, but alive, full of magic and power. You are the continuer of their path, the one who was supposed to come here and finish what was started." I stood where I was, the tension in my chest growing. I knew they were trying to prepare me for something, but I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready for the magic or the powers that lurked here. It was all too real, too painfully real. The medallion, once just a decoration, had become something meaningful, something I had to deal with. "You were chosen," the voice continued. "You came here because this is your destiny. This forest is not just a place. It holds memories. It holds those who came before you. They are waiting for you to learn their secret." My legs gave out and I finally slid to the ground. It was too much for me. How could a normal person understand such things? How could I be connected to this ancient forest and its inhabitants? I, who once thought that I was simply taking refuge here from the world, from people, now found myself in the center of an unimaginable story where everything was interconnected and inescapable. The creature in front of me stepped forward and its shadow swallowed me. I felt the ground beneath my feet begin to dissolve, as if I was losing my connection to this world. Another figure appeared in the darkness, clearer, more distinct. I recognized something familiar in its face, but I couldn't place it. "You must understand that the medallion is not just a symbol, it is a key. It opens doors that you should not open, but you have already opened them, and now you must go through them." The voice sounded as if it were speaking to me, but also to someone else, someone who had been in these woods many years ago. Images of other people standing in this place, languishing in ignorance, just like me, lost in these woods. I felt their souls reaching out to me, as if they were searching for an answer I could not give. The creature leaned toward me, and I felt its cold breath sliding across my skin. But in that moment, I realized I didn't need to look for answers. The answers were here. I just had to accept them. I didn't know how long I sat in this state of half-understanding, confusion, and fear. Time ceased to exist, and now there was only this place, the darkness of the forest, and the strange but powerful feeling that I was no longer alone. The thing before me, the shadow, seemed even less hostile now. Maybe it wasn't evil, or at least not what I was used to perceiving it to be. I needed to understand that if I was going to leave here alive. I remembered everything I knew about the medallion. It was a simple decoration, given to me as a keepsake, nothing more. I wore it for many years without thinking. It was simply a part of me, as part of my life, my existence. But now everything has changed. It has become a key connecting me to this place, to this forest and its hidden powers. The medallion continued to glow dimly in my hand. It was no longer just metal, It was something alive, and its light seemed much brighter now, as if it was ready to reveal something or lead me to something important. The shadow of the creature before me did not move. I noticed that it was becoming more distinct, as if its outlines were taking on a form that had deep meaning. It was no longer just a chaotic shadow. It was an image of something that belonged in this forest, and I had to figure out what that image was. "You are not alone," the voice said again, but it was different now, softer, less intimidating. "You did not come here by chance. You were chosen. You are part of something much greater than you could ever imagine." The creature moved smoothly, barely touching the ground. Its form seemed non-existent, changing like water, like smoke, but I still felt its presence. I did not know if it was some kind of spirit, an ancient being, or something else, but it was there, and it was watching me. I looked at the medallion in my hand. Its light had grown so bright that I could barely look at it. It was pulsing, as if there was life in it, not mine, but something that had existed before me, that had existed here, in this place, long before I was born. "You must understand that this place is not just a forest," the voice continued. "This is not just a natural habitat. This is the place of the ancients, the place of those who were here before you. You are a continuation of their path." I felt the ground beneath me begin to shake, as if it had a life of its own. The leaves on the trees began to tremble, and a strange, almost invisible mist appeared in the air. It was as if the place itself was beginning to react to my presence. "You must go further," the voice said. "You must see what lies beyond what you see. You must see who you really are." I didn't need an explanation to know that this forest wasn't just a forest, it was alive, and the medallion was a link between worlds. I felt its power begin to penetrate me, as if it were infusing my body with an unknown energy. The magic of this place. I felt my own spirit changing, that I was beginning to become part of what I once thought was myth. But there was another feeling too, fear. It wasn't just a feeling of power, it was a premonition. I knew that if I continued down this path, I wouldn't be able to go back. I wouldn't be able to return to my old life, to the world I had known until that moment. The forest had changed me and I was prepared for it, but it was scary to realize. "You must understand that this is not the end," the voice said, almost like a soft whisper. "You are only just beginning your journey, a journey that began long ago, a journey that is connected to everyone who wears this medallion." And at that moment I realized that none of this was a coincidence. Everything that was happening, all these strange events, this place and these forces, they were connected to me, to my past, to the fact that I was part of something bigger. I felt the powers hidden in this forest begin to fill me, powers that could be either a blessing or a curse. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew one thing. I was ready. Morning came, but it was not as usual. The forest I knew before seemed different now. Every tree, every stone, all of it was imbued with something invisible, but tangible. I was not just an observer here. I was a part of this world, as if it now lived in my soul. When I stood up, I noticed that the medallion I had held in my hands the night before was not gone. It was there, but it was no longer just decoration. It was a symbol, a reminder. It was connected to this place, to this forest, to its powers. I realized that I couldn't just leave. I couldn't just go back to my old life, because something about this place had changed me, and I knew that I was no longer the same. There was silence around me, but it was strange, unnatural. There were no sounds of animals, no rustling of the wind in the leaves. Everything was too quiet, as if everything was waiting for something important. I walked through the forest, not knowing where exactly, but feeling that my path was already predetermined. I walked for a long time, not noticing the time. Everything around me was like in a fog, blurry and unsteady. Sometimes it seemed to me that I saw figures flickering among the trees, but as soon as I got closer, they were gone. The forest seemed to be playing with me, as if it was not just nature, but something that was alive, aware. After a while, I came to a river. The water was dark, almost black, and it seemed to me that it was flowing too fast, as if it were trying to hide something. I sat down on the edge and looked into its depths. The water was clear, but it reflected more than just my eyes. I saw faces, unfamiliar, but still familiar. They were vaguely familiar, as if I had once seen them in my dreams. "You didn't come here by chance," the voice said again. It was closer than ever. I looked around but saw no one. Everything was still empty. "Your connection to this place is not just a coincidence. You were chosen." Am I chosen? I asked myself, not knowing what else to say. Chosen for what? "You must protect this place. You must be its guardian, its keeper." A strange feeling came over me. I knew that these words had meaning. The forest was alive, and I was now a part of it, part of something that existed outside of time and space. My life was no longer just mine. I was part of something far older than I could have imagined. Suddenly, a figure appeared before me. It emerged from the mist, from the water itself, as if it had come straight from its depths. It was the creature I had seen in my dreams. It was tall, with black eyes that looked straight into the soul. The creature did not speak, but I felt its presence. It was not a friend, but it was not an enemy either. It was part of this world, part of the forest. "Are you ready?" it asked without words, but I knew it was expecting an answer. I nodded, though my insides clenched. I wasn't ready, but I couldn't refuse. The creature raised its hand, and something like energy appeared in the air, which began to spin, forming a vortex that lifted me into the air. I felt the ground move away from me, the forest disappearing in this vortex. Everything around became unclear, unsteady, as if I were in another world. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them again, I was in a different place. The forest had disappeared. I was on top of a mountain, and before me was an incredible panorama that I could not understand. I was standing on the border of two worlds, and I knew that this place was my new reality. Story 5. When I first started working for the company, it was a bit difficult for me. Everything seemed new and a bit scary, especially considering that I came to this team without any real experience in this field. However, everything changed when I met him. He was one of the senior staff, a man who was always in the spotlight but never arrogant. I remember him coming up to me in the early days as I sat in an empty office trying to sort through a pile of paperwork. He didn't push himself, didn't lecture me like so many others, but simply offered to help. I liked that right away because it was so unusual among all the people I had interacted with. It was as if he wasn't trying to dominate, but on the contrary, he made me feel comfortable. His name was James. He was a few years older than me, enough to have experience and maturity, but he never seemed boring or distant. He was quite outgoing, always pleasant to talk to, and always tried to keep the conversation going, even if I didn't know what to say. His approach was gentle but confident, and with each passing day, I felt more and more comfortable around him. When I started to understand the intricacies of the work, he was the one who would always prompt, explain, and prevent mistakes. His advice was not intrusive, but rather in such a way that I myself would come to the right decision without feeling obligated. This was something new for me, and gradually I began to value his opinion more and more. But everything changed when we started spending more time together, and I started to see him not just as a colleague, but as someone I could talk to about life. He always asked questions, was interested in my hobbies, cared about how I was feeling. He wasn't a typical boss who just runs things. He was a person who really cared about people, and I felt it. His kindness, his desire to help, his tolerance, all of this attracted me to him. The first signs that there might be something more between us appeared when I was going through a difficult period in my personal life. I had broken up with a guy I had been dating for quite a while, and it was hard to get over it. James noticed that I was getting bored more often. I couldn't concentrate on work, and one day after a few weeks of this, he came up to me and asked me to go to a cafe to talk. At first I refused, hesitating to open up, but he didn't insist. He just said that if I ever wanted to talk, he was always there. I began to notice how his attention to me was different. It wasn't just professional concern. It was a care that went beyond a normal work relationship. He complimented me, but he did so in a way that didn't make me feel awkward. It wasn't about my appearance, but rather about how I approached my work, how I held myself. He often told me that I was talented and that I had a great future at the company. He was sincere, and his words didn't sound like something he was saying just to be polite. Then one day we were alone in the office after work. We talked about work for a while, then moved on to more personal topics, and I began to notice how he suddenly began to look at me differently. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something in his gaze had changed. It was as if he was looking at me with an interest that I hadn't noticed before. I felt something begin to rise inside me, as if there was something elusive in the air. It was hard to explain exactly what I was feeling, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. We continued working together for a few weeks, and our conversations became more and more personal. Sometimes he would talk about his life, how hard it had been for him after the divorce, how lonely he had been for a while, and I understood him. He told me how his ex-wife couldn't understand him, how they had no common interests, and how difficult it was to maintain a relationship when both were too busy with their own problems. He supported me during the period when I was going through my feelings after the breakup. We started spending more time together, and I realized that I started to look at him differently. He became someone special to me, someone I could confide in, and who was there when I needed him. It was unexpected, but I started to feel feelings slowly developing that I couldn't just ignore. And then one day, when we were alone, he told me that he felt there was something more between us, and I couldn't tell him that I felt the same. It was the beginning of our romance, but frankly speaking, I didn't expect it to turn out this way. I didn't think I would start a relationship with a person with such a huge age difference and such an informal status as him, an older colleague. But despite all these factors, I couldn't deny that I felt good with him, and I didn't want to lose this moment. That's how our relationship began. It wasn't fast or rushed. We both wanted to do things right, didn't rush into decisions, and were prepared for our communication to be based on trust and mutual respect. But despite all of that, I couldn't ignore the thought that I would have to face many difficulties related to our choice. When I decided to tell my best friend about my new relationship, I thought it would be a joyful moment. I expected her to be as supportive as ever, and that together we could discuss how things were going in my life. But the reaction was completely unexpected, and it remains one of the most vivid and painful memories of that time. I decided to tell her about James because I couldn't hide an important part of my life from her. My friend and I had known each other since childhood, and we always shared everything from small details to big life changes. She was not only my best friend, but also someone I could always discuss anything with, even the most personal things. So when I started dating James, I thought that for her, it would just be another milestone in my life that she would embrace with joy. But that didn't happen. When I shared the news with her, her eyes immediately darkened. She looked confused, not understanding what exactly I was telling her. At first, she remained silent, and then she began asking, "How can you date him?" She sounded as if she was sure I was making a mistake. I tried to explain how it all started, that we had common interests, that James not only supported me, but also genuinely cared about me. I tried to explain that despite the age difference and the fact that he was an older colleague, we had mutual feelings and everything happened naturally between us. But the more I tried to justify our choice, the more indignant she became. She couldn't understand how I could be with him. From her point of view, it was abnormal. She said it was some kind of power play, that I was in a subordinate position because he was my boss. I tried to explain that for me this was not the case, that relationships, despite our roles at work, were always based on mutual respect and consent. But she continued to say that the age difference was another problem. She believed that it was too early for me to get involved with a man who was much older than me, and that it was unlikely to lead to anything good. I tried to tell her that James was not who she thought he was. She couldn't understand why I didn't listen to her and accept her care. He was a stranger to her, unacceptable, and her opinion didn't change no matter how much I tried to explain my point of view. Her words hurt me. I couldn't understand why she couldn't support me. With every word she said, I felt a wall growing between us. The friend who had always been there for me now seemed like a stranger. It was hard to accept that the person I trusted most didn't approve of my choices. I tried to believe that her reaction was temporary, that she was just worried about me finding someone else, and that in time she would understand how important James was to me. But every word she said sounded like she was trying to talk me out of what I was feeling. We argued about this several times. Each time I was left at a loss, not knowing what to make of her reaction. I understood that she cared about me, that her concerns came from love, but at the same time, it was hard to perceive her attitude as an attempt to control my life. After all, I was an adult, and I needed to make my own decisions. But her words did not leave my head, and I began to doubt. What if she was right? What if I really was wrong? At such moments, anxiety overwhelmed me, and I felt like I was losing my balance. Over time, I noticed that James sensed this tension too. He knew I had told my friend about our relationship, and as much as he wanted it to not affect us, I noticed his attitude toward my friend changing. There were times when I would tell him about our last encounter, and his face would tighten, and he would remain silent, unsure of what to say. He knew it was important to me, but at the same time, he was disappointed that someone I loved and valued so much would not accept who I wanted to be with. At work, everything remained professional, and that was important to me. I didn't want the problems in my personal life to affect our collaboration, but my relationship with my friend began to deteriorate. Every conversation became more tense, and I felt like our bond was slowly breaking down. I began to avoid talking about James more and more, because I didn't want my friend to start arguing again. But that only made things worse. I felt uncomfortable when she asked how I was doing, and I felt like her questions were no longer about caring, but rather about finding out how I was feeling, so she could give me another assessment. It was a difficult period for me. I realized that I can't please everyone, but it hurt me that my friend didn't accept my personal life as it was. I still hoped that she would understand that this relationship was important to me, that I couldn't change my feelings just because of her concerns. But every day I felt the gap between us growing. It had been some time since I had told my friend about James, and the tension that had built up had me thinking often. My head was full of thoughts, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was at a crossroads. I knew that my relationship with James was not just a romantic affair, but also a serious test for me, and a test not only in terms of how the world perceives it, but also in how I perceive it myself. When I started dating James, I felt like he was a support during difficult times in my life. He became not only a friend, but also a person who could understand me on a deep level. It was easy and calm with him. We talked about life, about what was important to us, and I felt like I could be myself with him. This was a completely new experience for me, because in my previous relationships, I often lost myself trying to please the other person. With James, it was different. I felt like his support was genuine and that he valued me for who I was. But on the other hand, I knew that this choice was not that simple. The age difference was always an important topic for me, and I knew that people around me would pay attention to it. James was 30 years older than me, and although I felt that it did not matter to us, it was still difficult to ignore social stereotypes. I understood that in the eyes of many people, our relationship could look strange or even unacceptable. This uneasiness wasn't just external, it came from within. I asked myself questions that perhaps I should have asked earlier. Why did I choose him? Why wasn't I looking for someone closer to my age? I tried to sort through my feelings and figure out what it was that I found so attractive about him. But the more I thought about it, the clearer one thing became. James was the person I could be happy with, no matter what anyone else thought. I was also starting to notice that I was having a hard time opening up about the relationship. Every time I thought about sharing something important with my friends or family, I felt a wave of worry welling up inside me. What if they didn't understand? What if they were as judgmental as my friend? I knew that no one close to me would be thrilled about me dating an older man, and that scared me. I felt like if I told them the truth, they would react as negatively as my friend had. But on the other hand, I knew I couldn't hide my feelings any longer. After all, it was my life, my relationship, and I couldn't let other people's opinions dictate my decisions. I decided I would live my life the way I liked, and if it was a mistake, then let it be my mistake. With James, I began to wonder how much his background and experiences were influencing his behavior. He was a man who had been through a divorce and who I understood to be lonely. He told me that he had a hard time warming up to new people, that many people viewed him as a boss rather than a person, and that this was affecting his relationships with others. This explains some of his quirks, such as the rude comments he made early in our relationship. However, as I got to know him better, I realized that these comments were not malicious, but rather a misunderstanding. He was insecure and perhaps unsure of how to properly act around people. Every interaction we had made me feel like he was genuinely interested in being with me, and that building something real was important to him too. I could see how much he was worried about not being able to see my friends and family. He wanted us to be able to spend time together, not just in our work lives, but in our personal lives as well. His desire to get to know me better was an important and welcome sign to me that our relationship had potential. However, despite all this, I couldn't shake off the feeling of guilt towards my friend. I felt that I had betrayed her expectations, and that perhaps our friendship would never be the same again. It was hard for me to understand why she couldn't just support me like she always had. I began to look within myself for answers. Was I really making a mistake? Were my feelings not enough to justify my choices? But as I answered these questions, I increasingly came to the conclusion that I should follow my feelings, not other people's expectations. I still loved my friend, but I knew she couldn't be my main focus in life. My relationship with James was part of my journey, and I had to give it a chance, no matter what anyone else thought. It was hard to understand, but I increasingly realized that the only person whose opinion I should take seriously was myself. This morning was difficult. The sun's rays were breaking through the curtains, but they seemed cold and alien to me. I felt how hard it was to breathe, and my soul was anxious. I had been putting this moment off for a long time, and now it had come. Today I needed to talk to my friend. I knew that she would not accept my decision, and it was hard for me to imagine how our conversation would develop, but I could not put it off any longer. My friend and I have been friends for a long time, since childhood, and her opinion has always been important to me. She knew me like no one else. We always supported each other, shared our thoughts and experiences, but now everything has changed. I couldn't understand why her worries affected me so much. Why did her opinion become almost as important to me as my own happiness? I knew that she was worried about me, but at some point it became clear to me that her worries were simply blocking her ability to see me as I am. She couldn't understand that I had grown up, that I was independent and able to make decisions. It seemed to me that all she could do was consider me a stupid girl who didn't understand what she was getting herself into. And all this because of James. Every time I thought about telling her how I felt, I panicked. I knew she wouldn't accept James, knowing our age difference, knowing that he was my boss. She never understood how I could be with a man who was almost twice my age, and although she never directly expressed her displeasure to me, I felt it building up inside her. She saw it as a threat. I couldn't understand why she couldn't see that my feelings for James were genuine. He had been my support when I was going through a hard time, when I had just started working at the company and was depressed after breaking up with my previous boyfriend. He was there at the right time. He didn't just help me professionally, he supported me emotionally. He showed me that I could be more confident and strong, and I began to feel comfortable around him. But my friend couldn't understand that. To her, everything I did was a mistake. Her opinion, her fears, her concerns simply overshadowed all my arguments. When I arrived at the cafe, she was already sitting at the table. We had chosen this place because we had always felt comfortable here, and once upon a time we could sit for hours, chat, laugh, discuss anything. But today there was a strange feeling in this place, as if the air was thick and there was silence in it, heavy and dense. I sat down opposite her, but even before I said the first word, I felt how hard these minutes of silence were for me. My friend was not looking at me. Her gaze was directed somewhere into the distance, and this only increased my anxiety. I tried to collect my thoughts, but all I could think was that she had probably already decided everything for me, and my request for understanding would not change anything. I started to talk, but every time something would stop in my head. I had a hard time getting myself together to explain to her why my relationship with James was so important to me. I needed her to understand that I was an adult, that I could choose who I was with. But every time I thought about it, I would feel like I was breaking some of her rules. It was like I was betraying her trust by getting into a relationship with someone she didn't think was right for me. I started talking, but the words didn't come out the way I wanted them to. I talked about how James had supported me during a difficult time, how we had found common interests, how his support wasn't just in my professional life, but in my personal life as well. I talked about how he had helped me get my life back on track after breaking up with my previous boyfriend. He had become a close person to me, and all I wanted was for her to understand that this relationship was important to me. But I felt like my friend wasn't paying attention to my words. She was listening to me, but her face remained serious. Her eyes, which usually shone with interest, were full of worry and discontent. I felt the tension between us growing, and I understood that every argument I made only strengthened her doubts. I told her how much James cared about me, how he worried when he couldn't spend time with me, how important it was for him that she accepted him. But despite all my words, I didn't see understanding in her eyes. It was as if she was just waiting for me to understand that this was a mistake, for me to realize that such a relationship couldn't be happy. At some point, I realized that I couldn't convince her. I tried to calm down, trying not to show how hurt I was by her reaction. I explained that she had always been there for me, supporting me, but now I had to go my own way. I had to be honest with myself and with her. And while I still wanted her to accept James, I knew it would be a long process if she ever did. When I finished, there was silence. I looked at my friend, and although her face had relaxed, I could still sense that she was unsure. I knew this was a big change for her. It was hard for me, too, to accept that my feelings had changed her perception of our friendship so much. But I also knew I couldn't back out. I had to go through this, and maybe at some point she would also understand that I had made the right decision. After I talked to my friend, I felt empty. We didn't discuss James anymore, nor did we touch on the topic of our relationship, but this silence didn't bring relief. It hung between us like a thread that couldn't be broken, but it was so tight that I was afraid to break it. I couldn't forget her look, full of worry and discontent, even if she tried not to show it. The situation became more and more tense with each passing day. I began to avoid talking about James with my friend, even though I wanted to share with her how supportive he was, how we spent the weekend together, how I felt with him. But all of this seemed too personal to discuss with her. It hurt me to realize that she couldn't accept my happiness. And although I understood that she was worried about me, I couldn't help but think that her concern was something more than just caring. It was as if her own opinion about who was right for me was replacing my own feelings and desires. I tried to block out these thoughts, but I couldn't. No matter how hard I tried, it all came back to James and the image of him in my mind. He was still the same person who had supported me through the toughest times. Everything he did was genuine, and I knew he didn't just want to be with me. He cared about me growing as a person, about me becoming better at my job and in life in general. He was there when I needed him, and that was what mattered most. But every time I thought about sharing this with my friend, it became even harder. Work was no relief. James and I continued to communicate, but I could already feel our interactions taking on a new tone. Every time we met, I tried to be careful not to create unnecessary rumors. Even though he was my boss, deep down I knew that our relationship would still be discussed. People would not understand that it was real, that I was not simply in love with him because of his power or position. But no matter how hard I tried to hide it, I could feel the wary glances of my colleagues whenever we interacted. I thought a lot about how long I would have to hide my feelings, and the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that if I kept hiding, nothing would change. James wasn't just supporting me at work, he was an important part of my life. I knew that if my friend didn't understand that, I would have to move on anyway. I couldn't keep hiding our relationship. I couldn't keep living as if nothing had changed. It became clearer and clearer with each passing day that I needed to make a change, not just in my relationship with my friend, but in myself. I couldn't let her dictate what I should do or who I should be with anymore. It wasn't her decision, it was my choice. And I began to realize that no friendship was worth losing my independence and happiness for someone else's expectations. It was hard, but I felt a determination growing inside me, and I knew that if I didn't take this step, I would continue to feel lost. A few days passed and I met my friend again. I couldn't tell her that everything would be okay because I didn't know what would happen next. But I knew that I couldn't hide my feelings any longer, and I couldn't pretend that everything that was happening didn't matter to me. I made the decision to open up to her completely, to show her that I couldn't be the person she wanted me to be. And although I was afraid of her reaction, I couldn't stay afraid. I knew that if she didn't accept me for who I was, I would have to move on. We might not be as close as we once were, but I couldn't and wouldn't give up on what was important to me. I knew this meeting would be crucial. At some point, I had to set my boundaries, show that I was an adult and could make my own decisions. I couldn't let her fears control me. I couldn't let her expectations tear our relationship apart. I didn't know how she would react, but I was prepared for her not to understand me. But I was ready to accept that too. Life doesn't always give us the answers we want, but sometimes we have to look for them within ourselves. Those days were full of doubts and worries, but when I looked in the mirror, I saw how the uncertainty gradually disappeared. I felt that new opportunities were starting to appear on my path. I could be myself, despite everything that was happening around me. With each passing day, I felt my relationship with James becoming not just a part of my life, but an integral part of it. It wasn't just a fling. We were truly building something that felt solid, albeit tender. My feelings for him weren't the result of loneliness or a desire to find someone to fill a void. It was a real, genuine connection. He was someone who knew how to support, how to guide, but most importantly, he respected me and my desires. We talked about many things, sometimes long and deep, and sometimes just shared silences that meant just as much. But behind all these moments, there was another world, one that was being created around us. Colleagues at work began to talk, and I couldn't help but notice how their gazes sharpened when I was near him. I tried to ignore it, but every glance, every question, even the unspoken wariness made me feel on edge. No matter how hard I tried to keep my cool, I could still feel their judgmental gaze. I couldn't shake the feeling of anxiety. Every day at work became more and more stressful. James tried to be careful, but his positive energy, his attention to me, always raised questions in others. I felt like this situation was starting to become unbearable. Despite his support, despite the fact that our relationship was important and real to me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were both under a microscope. My friend was the first to voice her concerns, but as it turned out, she was not the only one. When I returned home, thoughts of James and my friend were always closely intertwined in my mind. The pain I felt when I thought about my friend not accepting my choice became more and more vivid. My relationship with her was at risk. I could not make her understand why I chose James. It was simply impossible for her. She could not accept his age, his position, the fact that he was my boss. I tried to justify my feelings, to explain that everything that happened between us was sincere, but each time I encountered her closed perception. But then other thoughts began to appear on the horizon, and perhaps this was the only part of this whole situation that I could control. I realized that I couldn't constantly worry about how others viewed me. I couldn't let other people's expectations and views define my life. It was my right to be happy. And I began to realize more and more clearly that I could no longer allow myself to hide in the shadows of other people's fears and anxieties. I felt a change begin to happen inside me. The fear that had previously paralyzed me was disappearing. I understood that I was not obliged to answer for other people's feelings and decisions. If my friend could not accept my happiness, then that was her problem, not mine. She was still an important person to me, but I could no longer allow her to dictate what was right and what was wrong. I could no longer be afraid of her opinion. This realization set me free. I understood that if I continued to be afraid of other people's opinions, I would never be truly free. And James helped me with this. His calm, His confidence in our relationship gave me strength. Every time I doubted, he gave me space to think, without imposing himself, but staying close when I needed support. I began to feel how it was easier for me to be myself, how I did not need to hide my feelings, my desires. It was a liberation that I had never experienced before. However, despite this feeling of inner freedom, I still couldn't get my friend out of my mind. Every silence, every glance we exchanged made me think that maybe I had lost her forever. I tried not to burden myself with it, but it was the reality I was facing. We no longer discussed James, and she didn't try to understand me. And despite my best efforts, I felt our friendship slowly fading. It was painful, because I still hoped that with time, things would get better. But I knew that maybe I just had to let go. I couldn't keep holding on to something in my life that wasn't mutual. And despite my worries, I was starting to feel a new light at the end of this road. I stopped expecting people to accept my decisions. I started looking within myself for the strength to live the life I wanted. James and I continued to build our relationship, regardless of the looks of others. And although I didn't know what the future would bring, I was no longer afraid. My life was in my hands. There came a point when I realized that I could no longer carry the weight of other people's expectations on me. I was freed internally. And although my friend was still in my life, her attitude toward me and my decisions no longer affected how I perceived myself. I no longer allowed her opinion to dictate my steps. My relationship with James had become mine, and I was ready to continue to develop it without hiding or giving in to outside pressure. Despite this, I was still worried about our surroundings. Although I was calm inside, the fear of being judged did not disappear completely. Work was becoming more and more difficult every day, because every step I took with James attracted attention. We could no longer hide the fact that there was something more between us than just a business relationship. I saw how colleagues began to discuss us, how their looks became more and more wary, and sometimes it seemed to me that all these questions and gossip were about to go beyond the office and cause rumors among others. But I learned to ignore it. It didn't mean I stopped being afraid. I still worried, but I finally accepted that I didn't have to live by someone else's standards. I was an adult, and I made my own decisions. It was hard, especially when people judge you without understanding, but I learned to deal with it and move on. James became a rock for me, but he wasn't free from his own worries. Even though he was older than me, despite the difference in age and status, he still felt insecure. He was worried that people at work might start gossiping about his personal life, about how he behaved in relationships. Although he was a mature person, his worries and fears were also real. And the more I thought about our future, the clearer it became that these fears should have become our shared experiences and not something that destroyed our relationship. We couldn't avoid it. Every time we were around people, I felt the way people looked at us change. I felt more and more people start asking questions, start looking for something ridiculous or unacceptable in our behavior. But deep down, I knew it was temporary. That fear of being judged, of being misunderstood, was fading. I wasn't thinking about how others perceived me anymore. I was thinking about what was important to us and what was important to James and me for each other. I couldn't say that everything was perfect. There was still a lot left to decide, and I still worried about my friend's reaction. But something inside me had changed. I no longer let other people's words and opinions ruin what James and I had built. I learned to be more open, to accept not only my feelings, but also my choices, even if they didn't match other people's expectations. Acceptance was an important step. I realized that I couldn't constantly be afraid of being judged. It was hard, but I became more confident. And although my relationship with my friend remained difficult, I no longer felt guilty for choosing my path. I realized that it's important to go where you feel happy, not where others expect you to be. James continued to support me without being pushy, but always there when I needed his help. His calm and maturity were qualities I began to appreciate more and more. He didn't try to change me, he accepted me as I was, and that was the most important thing. He showed me that a relationship is not only about support, but also about understanding. Every day I felt more and more like I was finding my way. It wasn't always easy, but I wasn't afraid to move forward anymore. I could move forward regardless of what others thought. My relationship with James wasn't just something I hid, but something I was proud of. I learned to be honest with myself, and that was the most important lesson in this story. In the end, true freedom comes when you stop depending on the views of others and start living the way you want. Story 6. I'm not going to make excuses, but you might find it hard to believe what I'm about to tell you. You might think I'm crazy, but I ask you not to jump to conclusions before you hear the whole story. I'm not a fantasist or a fool. I'm a scientist, and my team and I have created something that people in the past could only dream of. We have created a time machine. Now you think that sounds absurd, right? But let me explain. I worked in a government lab where we did research in all sorts of fields of science that ordinary people couldn't even dream of. We had access to technologies that didn't exist in the public consciousness and to knowledge that was hidden from the general public. We worked on projects that were almost impossible for other scientists. There was no room for the ordinary in our world, only for unexplored horizons. My team was the best. We were ambitious, driven, and most importantly, dedicated to our goal. 13 years. That's how long it took to create a time machine capable of sending a person into the past or the future. We didn't come to this decision right away. We started with simple experiments, exploring the theory of relativity and various hypotheses about the space-time continuum. But all theories about time travel were pure science fiction until we found a way to turn them into reality. It all started with a simple device designed to manipulate time on a local level. We didn't expect to be able to do anything truly revolutionary. These were small experiments with time shifts that allowed us to affect objects within a few minutes or hours. But gradually we learned to take steps further. Our first successes were modest, small changes in the structure of time that had no obvious consequences. But even then we began to realize that we were on the threshold of something much larger. We developed a device that could send a person into the past or the future, and now finally we were ready for the first real test. The time we could change was limited, just 15 years forward or backward. That was enough to understand how the machine worked, but not enough to completely change the course of history. We decided that the first experiment would be to send me back in time. No more than a few hours to confirm that the device could work in real-world conditions. I still remember sitting in the chair, securing myself in the time machine, and waiting to be transported back a few hours. My heart was beating faster. This was a historic moment. A moment when my colleagues and I could prove to ourselves that we had truly changed the world. I could see the countdown screen in front of me, and I could feel the space around me begin to warp slightly. Seconds turned into fractions of a second, and here I was, in the past. The world around me had not changed, at least not at first, but I felt something strange, as if part of reality was not as I remembered it. I got out of the car and walked to my office. The surroundings were familiar, but strange. I had been here before, but something about this place was different from what I remembered. I noticed briefly that there was a different painting on the wall, and there was a slight distaste in the air, as if the entire office had been slightly distorted. This was not the world I had left in, but not the one I had returned to. I felt fear. Fear that the changes might not be so small, that everything I had seen and known might just be part of a larger process that I could not stop. When I returned to the lab, everything seemed normal, but I knew that not everything would be as before. We had taken a step into the unknown, and this step could mean that our reality had already begun to change. We were careful because we knew that even the most minor changes could lead to unpredictable consequences. But the time machine worked. It did not destroy us, did not absorb space-time, as described in science fiction. It only sent me back in time and returned. However, this was only the first step. Our next experiments were to be much more ambitious. We planned to send one of our team members into the future, 15 years into the future. At first, I was against the idea because any change in the future seemed too risky to me. But the group insisted. We had to check what exactly awaited us and what the consequences might be. At that moment, I didn't know that this experiment would be crucial. We couldn't predict what would happen, but everything changed when Dylan, one of our best researchers, decided to test the machine first. I should have stayed calm. But in that moment, I knew we were on the brink of something that could change everything. Our lives, our reality, would all depend on how we use this technology, and I didn't know what Dylan would bring back. I sat in the lab and looked at the time machine. A strange feeling grew inside me. This device my colleagues and I had created was supposed to be our greatest achievement, but now I sensed something more. Something dark that tormented me every time I looked at it. We were on the brink of something that might disrupt the very fabric of reality. Dylan stood next to me preparing for his journey. He was determined. He was always like this. Stubborn, ambitious, sometimes even overconfident. He was ready to step into the future to see what awaited us, even in the face of all the warnings and doubts. We were all nervous, of course, but Dylan was determined to test the car. "Are you sure?" I asked him again, although I already knew the answer. "Absolutely," Dylan replied without turning around. He seemed lost in his own thoughts and didn't hear me. His expression was determined, but also anxious. I noticed his fingers trembling slightly as he adjusted the controls. Even if I told him to stop, he would still go. I couldn't change his mind, nor could I stop him from doing so. It was his decision, his desire. At first, everything went swimmingly. The time machine began to emit a faint light, and the screen lit up, showing dark, distorted lines as space and time began to warp around Dylan. We stood in silence watching as his figure slowly disappeared from view, swallowed up by the vortex of time. Time seemed to stand still. We just waited. The minutes dragged on forever, but it seemed like only a few seconds had passed before the machine began to hum and the image on the screen became clear. Dylan was back, but it was not the same Dylan who had gone to the future. He looked shocked. His eyes were wide with fear, and his face was burnt out, as if he had experienced something terrible that could not be part of reality. His hands were clenching and unclenching the air, as if he were trying to hold on to something invisible. He did not say a word. We all stood there holding our breath, watching him, but he just continued to stare ahead, as if he did not notice us. When Dylan finally spoke, his voice was expressionless, as if his soul was somewhere far away and his body was simply moving along on inertia. "It's over. It's over." His words echoed over and over in my head. It was strange, as if he was speaking not to us, but to himself. But what exactly did he see? We tried to ask him questions, tried to understand what had happened, but he didn't answer. All we heard were meaningless, mumbling phrases. He just repeated his phrase like a mantra. At that moment, I knew something had gone wrong. But what? We all knew that time travel wasn't supposed to be safe. We understood that changing even one small aspect of time could have unexpected consequences. But this was all theoretical, in a lab setting where we controlled every step. Dylan was back, but what did he bring with him? He suddenly ran towards the exit, ignoring our attempts to stop him. We tried to approach him, but he was already behind the door, and only his last words, which he muttered as he walked, remained an echo in our minds. "It's all over." I stood there stunned, unsure of what to do next. We tried to find an explanation for what had happened. Was his perception somehow impaired? Was his brain unable to process what he had seen? But why would he run if everything was as he remembered it? The first few minutes of silence in the lab were paralyzing. We all knew that Dylan had experienced something big, something we couldn't explain. He was perhaps the first person in history to visit the future, but his reaction was so extraordinary that we couldn't figure out what exactly had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the brink of something incredible, but also dangerous. Dylan wasn't just shaken, he was shattered, and his tragedy became our own shadows. There was only one thought left in the lab that wouldn't leave me. We can't just keep working. We can't just ignore what happened. I went to my room and sat at my desk, flipping through my notes, trying to figure out what we might have missed. How many mistakes might we have made? Should we have stopped sooner? These questions plagued me, and I didn't know how to answer them. Could I really understand what had happened to Dylan and what would happen to us? We couldn't have predicted that our invention would turn out to be such a disaster. We couldn't have expected that the result of our experiments would lead to such consequences. As the night wore on, there was only one question in my head. What did he see? I sat at my desk, trying to think clearly, but the uneasiness that had been creeping over me since Dylan's return wouldn't go away. It was a strange feeling, like I wasn't in my body, like I was watching everything that was happening from the outside. But I couldn't intervene. It was the first time I had begun to doubt our research, what we were doing. The next day, the lab was tense. We all felt that something was wrong, but no one knew exactly how to fix it. Dylan had disappeared. He had left the lab in such a hurry that no one had time to stop him, and when we tried to find him, the trail went cold. I knew it wasn't just panic. He had seen something in the future that had changed him, and it was something he couldn't put into words. I sat in my office reviewing the tapes from the experimental sessions, trying to find some clue as to what we might have missed. The time machine worked. It did send people back in time, and this was confirmed not only by my own travels, but by Dylan's return, though not in the form we expected. But what exactly had he seen? What could have affected his psyche so much that he seemed to lose touch with reality? I knew he was not the type to lose control easily. He was intelligent, sober, and always acted with deliberation. But now there was only emptiness in his eyes, and his words were an empty repetition. "It's over." Each of us experienced the aftermath of this experiment in our own way. Some tried to see something in what had happened that could be explained scientifically. They said it was the result of psychological pressure, that the person was not ready to face what awaited him in the future. But I knew it was not just stress or psychosis. It was something more, something that filled me with icy fear. Time became stranger the more I thought about what had happened. Each new step in research, each new discovery, was like a step into the dark, the unknown. We didn't know what we had created until we saw how it affected people. I tried to understand what could be so terrifying in the future, that it could alter consciousness so much. I looked again at the time machine, standing in the center of the lab. Its metal surfaces reflected the faint light from the window, and it seemed unaffected by what had happened. It stood there, a motionless witness to what we had just done. I knew it had been our achievement, but now it seemed a curse. We had created a time machine, but what had we really done? It wasn't just a tool for travel, it was a weapon that could alter reality, and we didn't know how to use it. Dylan was gone, and the answers were gone with him. I could feel his words echoing in my head. It's over. He wasn't just shocked. He was sure that the future he saw was the worst possible outcome. He couldn't take us back to the moment we were in before all this started, but he couldn't accept what had happened either. It was like a disease, like he was infected with knowledge he couldn't shake. And so, here in this lab, there was a silence that was almost tangible. We were all trying to find a solution, trying to understand what exactly we had created, but each new answer only created more questions. Our reality was beginning to crack at the seams. Dylan was gone, and his disappearance was dragging everything down with it. Our research, our colleagues, the entire project we had worked so hard to build, all that was left was uncertainty and fear of what was to come. I knew one thing. We couldn't just keep experimenting like we had been doing. We had to find an answer to what exactly Dylan had seen and how it related to what we had done. If we didn't find an answer, if we didn't understand what had happened, the consequences could be far more catastrophic than we could ever imagine. It became clear to me at that moment, we can't trust what we create until we understand what to do with it. We had to understand what Dylan had discovered and what it meant for all of us. Time had become our enemy, and the only way out was to find Dylan if he was still alive. The days dragged on like a viscous substance, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something in our world had already changed. What we had considered a simple scientific experiment soon became a dangerous game with reality. The time machine no longer seemed like a technological marvel to us. It had become a threat that we could not control. Absorbed in the idea of achieving the impossible, we did not even realize how fragile the balance was that we had destroyed. The lab was tense, but no one dared to say anything out loud. We were all experiencing this moment in our own way, but no one knew how to react to what had happened to Dylan. We were afraid that he would discover something that would destroy our understanding of time, of life, of human consciousness. We were afraid that everything we were doing now would lead to a catastrophe that could affect not only us, but all of civilization. What haunted me was that Dylan wasn't alone. The moment he disappeared, it wasn't just him that changed. Something bigger changed. Reality itself. The very fabric of time we were trying to manipulate. We couldn't figure out what had happened, and we probably never would have unless we'd started looking for answers in places we'd usually ignored. Every morning I came to the lab with a new question, but no answers. We tried to find traces of Dylan, to try to contact him, but there was no trace. It seemed he had disappeared, just as all our hopes had disappeared. But what if he hadn't really disappeared? What if he had simply vanished from our reality? I began spending more time alone, studying my notes and thinking about what might have happened when Dylan returned from the future. I reviewed every detail, every possible consequence, and finally I came to a terrible thought. Maybe when Dylan returned, he brought with him more than just a vision of the future. He might have brought something with him that had left an imprint on reality, as if he had become a conduit for something from beyond, and now that influence was spreading to us. The lab was strangely quiet. We were all on edge, like we were teetering on a threshold, and every step into the unknown could be fatal. But we couldn't stop. We couldn't just forget what had happened. Because if Dylan was right, if the future really was what he saw, then we couldn't afford to ignore it. We had to figure it out. It took me a few days to decide on the next step. I realized we had to go back to the beginning, to the time machine itself. We could try to understand how it worked, what happened when a person traveled to the future. We had to figure out what exactly happened to Dylan, but I also knew it could be dangerous. That day, I decided to try the machine again, but not on myself. I knew that any experiments on myself could end unpredictably. I prepared everything necessary to send a small object, not a person, through the time machine. This was the simplest way to check what exactly happens to those who pass through it. The machine was ready. I sat in front of it and checked all the parts. The whole team stood in tension, watching my every move. Everyone knew that our future depended on this experiment, but no one knew what would happen next. Even I didn't know what might happen when I started this process. I placed a small metal object in front of the machine and pressed a button. At that moment, everything around me seemed to go silent. The whole world seemed to stop. I saw the object slowly disappear into the center of the machine, absorbed by its bright light. But before I could understand what had happened, the light disappeared and the object returned. It was perfectly normal. No changes, no anomalies. But when I looked at its surface, I noticed something strange, a small spot that shouldn't have been there. It looked as if it had been carved out by time, as if the object had been slightly warped by reality itself. I knew this couldn't be a coincidence. Something was wrong. I looked at the time machine again. It was the same as always, but now I realized that we might not just have created a device that sends you into the past or future. We've created a mechanism that can change reality itself. This experiment was our last. We could no longer trust the time machine. I knew that even if we stopped all work now, the consequences would be with us forever. But that was just the beginning. We couldn't go back. We had created something that was no longer in our power. And it was clear to me. If we don't understand exactly how this machine works, if we don't understand exactly what happened to Dylan, then we'll all end up in a time trap from which we won't be able to escape. The days continued to drag on, each one bringing new questions. I no longer felt like a part of reality. In every step, in every glance, in every little change in the world around me, I began to feel that we had not simply created a time machine. We had awakened something greater, something that was now changing everything, something that might already have begun to affect us. Reality, the very fabric of time. After the last experiment with the object, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had missed something. I thought it had been too easy a test, too safe. I was on the verge of risking it again, this time with a human. But even the thought that someone from my team might end up in the time machine again made me uneasy. I had to understand what we had done, and it was more than just pressing a button and waiting for results. We weren't just sending people to another time. We were possibly altering the very fabric of their existence. And if that was true, if every experiment we did could disrupt the familiar flow of time, then we all risked losing not only control, but the reality we lived in. A constant sense of unease was with me. I no longer trusted time. It had become dark and shaky, and everything I knew about it seemed unreliable. More and more people around me began to notice oddities that had gone unnoticed before. Colleagues I had worked with for years now seemed like strangers. They became strangely silent, as if they knew more than they were telling us. Their gazes became wary, almost suspicious. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I felt like reality was beginning to disappear before my eyes. One day, as I was sitting in my office, I heard a strange noise. It was a sound that shouldn't be in a lab, a sound like someone was trying to break into my reality from somewhere outside. I got up and walked down the hallway, but found nothing. The lab was empty except for a few researchers who didn't seem to notice anything strange. I went back to my office and opened my notes, trying to focus. And then I noticed that one of the pages in my journal had been torn out. It was the same journal I used to write down my thoughts and observations. I reread the rest of the notes, but it was only that one moment. I felt like something was wrong with my memory. Something was blurry about what I thought was important, as if I was losing part of my perception of time. At that moment, one of my colleagues came to see me. He stood at the threshold of my office and looked at me with such eyes as if he was hiding something. I tried to concentrate, but his gaze was too intense to ignore. "Dylan's gone," he said before I could speak. It was the only thing he said, and I knew immediately that it wasn't just words. It was a warning. Dylan wasn't just physically gone. He was gone from our reality, as if he'd never existed. I tried to find a trace of him, over and over, but I found nothing. His name was gone from all systems, and those around him couldn't even remember that he'd ever been part of the team. We began to forget his name, what he looked like, or even who he was to us. Strangely, I began to feel as if I, too, was losing something important, something I couldn't get back. I realized then that Dylan hadn't just disappeared. He'd become part of what we'd created. Maybe his presence in the past or future wasn't just a consequence of his involvement in the project, but part of the unimaginable time warp we'd set in motion. I couldn't prove it, but I knew it was true. I tried to talk to the others again. I tried to get them to admit that we were up against something we couldn't control, but no one wanted to listen. My colleagues began to avoid me, as if I were the bearer of some dangerous idea. There was something else in their eyes. They were scared, but not of what I thought. They were scared of something they couldn't understand. Everything became blurry, as if we were living in a world where time no longer worked as we knew it. Every morning I woke up and wondered, what if tomorrow nothing was the same as yesterday? And with each passing day, I realized more and more that our project had become a catalyst for something much more powerful. We weren't just exploring time, we were starting to destroy it. I couldn't find any explanation for what was happening. All I knew was that we had started a journey down an unknown path that led to nowhere. If we didn't stop it, there might be no way back. We had started playing with something that was too dangerous for us. I sat in my office, feeling time creeping away around me, and it became clear to me that if we don't find a way to stop this project, if we don't decide what to do with what we've created, the consequences will be things I can't even imagine. A few weeks passed, and I began to notice the world around me changing. It seemed that the changes we had started with the time machine had now spread to every aspect of our lives. I could no longer trust what was happening in the lab. All the technology we were working with became so strange and unstable that it almost seemed alive. Their behavior became unpredictable. Electronic devices began to show glitches, and I could no longer accurately determine when something was happening. At times, I felt like I was in a permanent nightmare, where time became fluid and changeable. It was like a terrible game with fate. We started to create a machine to change the future, but it seemed that this machine made us participants in a game where no one knew who would win. We tried to manipulate time, not realizing that perhaps it was time that was starting to manipulate us. I often walked around the lab alone, wondering what had happened to Dylan. He was the first person to actually see the future, though his perception was warped by horror. But what had he seen to change himself so much? I kept thinking about it, because what had happened to him had roots that went much deeper than it seemed. Every day I tried to find some explanation for what was happening, and everything I found only confirmed my suspicions. I remembered everything Dylan had said, and every word he said now sounded like a warning. "It's over," he'd said before he disappeared. I began to wonder more and more if he hadn't just seen the future, but had become part of some catastrophe we couldn't predict. One day, as I was walking down the hallway, I noticed a group of employees standing in front of the lab entrance, discussing something in low voices. As I approached, the conversation suddenly stopped, and all eyes turned to me. It was strange. I was sure they weren't discussing anything important, but their reaction, it felt like they were worried about something I didn't know. At that moment, I knew I had to leave. It wasn't just a feeling of unease, it was an inner knowing. I knew that if I stayed in the lab, I could be drawn into something even more dangerous. We were playing with forces we couldn't understand, and now we might be part of something far greater and more destructive. I left that day, but even on the way home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It was as if I had become part of something else, part of this new time stream we were beginning to create. Every morning I woke up with a feeling that reality would not be as I remembered it. I began to notice oddities in the world around me. Simple things were not as they should be. Small details that had gone unnoticed before now caught my full attention. An unnaturally clear sky, dark shadows that moved in the periphery of my vision, or even words that seemed familiar to me but were not in our language. I even heard a voice in my head a few times, as if someone was whispering in my ear, but every time I tried to turn to see who it was, no one was there. Time had become what might be called impermanent. I could no longer tell when it was day or night. There was no longer the familiar sense of constancy, and that was only the beginning. When I returned to the lab, I realized that my colleagues, like me, were no longer the same people. Everything was changing. I walked back to the time machine, which stood in the center of the lab, a permanent reminder of where we had started. It still looked the same as before, but now there was a strange vibration in its mechanism. Something was happening to this machine. Something was wrong, and I felt it with every cell in my body. Something was changing. I didn't know if it was because of what Dylan and I had created or because of what had happened to him, but I knew one thing. We couldn't go on. We couldn't just destroy the flow of time without understanding the consequences. As I approached the machine and touched it, I suddenly felt the space around me begin to distort. Time literally slipped through my fingers. That moment was as if I found myself in the very center of chaos, where there was no past, no future, only an endless here and now that sought to engulf everything. I stepped back, gasping at the realization of what we had done. We hadn't just explored time, we had become part of its destruction. And if we didn't stop, if we didn't find a way to put it all back, we would end up in a world where no one could find their way. I knew I couldn't go back to the world I'd once been a part of. This project, this experiment, had become my prison, and maybe I wouldn't be able to get out. But maybe it wasn't just me. Maybe it was all of us. With each day that I spent outside the lab, I felt more and more like the world I knew was dissolving, like sand between my fingers. It wasn't just a loss of reality. It was a sense that the very fabric of existence was being torn apart, as if by exploring it, we had violated its fundamental laws. I tried to understand what had happened to Dylan, and why his disappearance had left such a deep mark that everything around us was crumbling. I decided to go back to the lab again, hoping to find answers. I couldn't ignore it. I thought that maybe if I went back to the time machine, I could figure out what really happened, why Dylan left, and what he was trying to prevent. But when I walked into the lab, it was clear that something had changed. There was no longer the familiar hum of the equipment, no longer that cold anxiety that always hung in the air. Everything was dull and dark now. All the equipment I knew now looked abandoned, as if many years had passed since anyone had used it. My gaze fell on the time machine. It stood in the center of the room, but now its metal parts seemed older than they actually were. It was as if it were oxidizing, as if the machine itself felt that it was no longer meant to exist in our time. I came closer, and my hand touched the cold surface. At that moment, I felt the world around me begin to distort again. I felt as if time began to shrink, as if someone was burning it at the ends, and it began to diverge in different directions. That moment was like a border zone, like the moment when I realized that I was at the point of no return. I froze for a moment, and my heart sank. I felt the space around me begin to blur. It wasn't a feeling of anxiety or fear. It was a feeling of loss. Something was gone. Something was lost forever. And in that moment, I realized I had become part of something that had destroyed not only my reality, but everything I had ever known. My hand, still leaning on the machine, began to slide along the cold metal. At that moment, I heard a voice that seemed to come from the very depths of the machine. It was a quiet, muffled whisper that made me freeze. I couldn't understand what it was, but perhaps I didn't want to understand anymore. "You don't understand," the voice said. But it wasn't Dylan. It was an alien voice, a voice I couldn't identify. It wasn't just from outside. It was everywhere. It had an ancient feel to it, a wisdom I couldn't quite place. It was part of the time machine itself, part of what we had created. I pulled my hand back, and reality came into focus again. But the world was no longer the same. I felt everything around me begin to thicken, as if time was beginning to flow, and every second was important. Everything I had known now seemed like a memory of another world I had once known. I began to understand that we had not simply destroyed reality. We had created something new, unknown and dangerous. And if we did not stop this process, the world we lived in would disappear. It would dissolve into an unknown abyss, and we would remain only shadows of what had been. We had created a time machine to change the future, but perhaps we had forgotten that sometimes the future does not want to be changed. I stood there, feeling the space around me lose its shape, as if I were on the verge of disappearing. And in that moment, I realized that the only way to end this nightmare was to go back to the very beginning. But to do that, I needed to understand what exactly we had broken, what exactly we had created. With every step I took in the lab, I felt myself getting closer to the point of no return. And in that moment, I realized that if we didn't stop this machine, if we didn't destroy it, then everything I had ever known would disappear. I turned and walked out of the lab. But at that moment, I wasn't sure I could go back. Time had become unstable, and even if I found a way to stop it, I wasn't sure I'd return to the world that was once mine. We played with time, but now time played with us.